University?
For them. Okay. Your mail.
That's the female.
We're going to try something different. We're not doing monitors down there, so.
Saved me a lot of time.
Well, we'll see.
We'll see. I'm considering you my backup.
We may not get audio.
Oh, really? Because of this part? Because not because of me, because I could.
No.
I could just get it off my screen.
Do I need to go back and get? You got audio?
Yeah, she's talking in her mic right now, so let's record her, and then let's see if it works out the way we want it to. If it did, then we're good. We can adjust the sound as we go.
Maybe set it up in the other room. There's a card in there too. Let's keep the card out. Dot her I's across the T's. Can you hear anything out of this? Are you getting audio? You see what? Okay. Wait, Julie's gonna talk. No audio?
Keep talking.
Good morning, and can you hear me in the back? Excellent. Good morning, my name is Julie McIntosh. I am the Dean of the College of Education here at the University of Findlay, and we welcome you to this second Midwestern Symposium on Teacher Evaluation. You will see in your program the schedule for today and where all the rooms are located right here, either on the first or second floor. There is an elevator available to you if you go out the doors and to the right. We are thrilled to have you on campus today for so many fabulous presentations. Teacher evaluation is an important topic to discuss in order to better inform practitioners as to the best practices and research to inform our decision making when it comes to assessing student learning. I have always been a strong supporter of Linda Darling-Hammond's work, and we are thrilled to have her speaking as our keynote today. We hope you enjoy the event today, and on behalf of the College of Education and the University of Findlay, I'd like to thank the organization committee that put this event together, including Dr. Buzz Dyer, Dr. John Gillum, Dr. Mary Heather Munger, Dr. Nicole Williams, Dr. Gwen Reif, Patty Holcomb and Abby Loy and her daughter who gave you a bag today. And most definitely, I'd like to thank Dr. John Brassfield for organizing this event. You have a very nice welcome from him in your program. I hope you enjoy today's event and plan to visit the University of Findlay again in the future. And if you have a moment, please stop over and see our Mazza Museum. It is a very unique feature on campus that has art from children's picture books, and it should be open today if you'd like to stop over during lunch. So without further ado, Dr. John Brassfield.
Good morning. Everybody got some breakfast, I hope? All right, good. The coffee and the water and juice and everything will be out all day, so feel free to partake. I'm going to go ahead and give my written remarks here. Hello, and welcome to the 2017 Midwestern Symposium on Teacher Evaluation. I am Dr. John Brassfield, Conference Chair. Thank you all for coming. We're excited to get the day going, and before we do, I have a few housekeeping items. First, I would like to thank our sponsors for this event, California Casualty, Home and Auto Insurance, and the Wren Hill Group. Their support made today's events possible, and we greatly appreciate their involvement. Both organizations have representatives here today, so if you'd like to find out what they can do for you, feel free to visit them in the lobby between sessions. They're right there, conveniently located by the coffee. So if you'll turn your attention to the agenda inside your folder, I'm just going to give you kind of a brief outline of how the day is going to work. In here, we're going to do the keynote address first, and then after that, at 10 a.m. and then again at 11 a.m. we're going to do breakout sessions in the various classrooms. This year we managed to put everything on the first floor. So all of the breakout sessions are here on the first floor in the classrooms that just kind of surround this auditorium, 150 through 154. After the 11 o'clock sessions ends, we'll have lunch back in this room. It'll be served buffet style back there. After lunch will be one more breakout session at 1 p.m. And then at 2 p.m. we'll gather back in here for a panel discussion at the end of the day. I'll have some more details about the panel discussion in a moment. But first, I want to call your attention at the registration table. You should have picked up a sheet that said MWSTE Agenda Updates and Changes. We don't have anything major to announce, but there were just a few notes that I want to make sure that you know in case you were going to go to any of these sessions. During the 10 o'clock session, the session titled OTES and Differentiation, a Review of the Literature by Jason Robinson, is in room 151, not room 152. So, in room 152 at 10 a.m., April Ely from the Ohio Department of Education will be giving an update on evaluation from the Ohio Department of Education. Also, at the 1 p.m. block of presentations, we have added Karen Carney from Campbell Schools to the presentation, the ESB recommendations for OTES. So Karen will be in there as well. During the 1 o'clock hour in room 154, the Superintendent Perspectives on Teacher Evaluation session has been canceled, unfortunately. And then at 2 p.m. during the panel discussion, Deb Tully, unfortunately, will not be with us today, but she has been replaced by Sandy Orth, also affiliated with the Ohio Federation of Teachers. So if you have any questions on that, any of this stuff, you can find me. I'm in the purple shirt, and my name says John Brassfield. If you got here at all early, you noticed that Linda Darling-Hammond was doing a book sale and signing out in the lobby. If you wanted to participate in that but were unable to first, she's agreed to do a few more minutes after the keynote before the first round of breakout sessions, so you'll have one more chance to buy a book or get it signed or have a chat if you'd like to do that. Also, all of you should have in your folders a few index cards. Is that correct? Do you guys see the blank index cards? We did this during the last symposium, and it seemed to work really well. We have a panel discussion at the end of the day with some various experts with different perspectives on teacher evaluation. And we found it was a really good idea if the questions for the panel came from attendees. So now or during the keynote address, if you have something you would like for the panel to answer, some question you have that maybe the keynote sparks in you, if you would just jot that question down on your index card and leave it on your table when you leave the room. I'll collect those and I'll go through them during lunch, and we'll pick out a few questions. Also, if you're in a session and a question comes to you and you want to jot it down on an index card, you can just leave it up at the registration table as well, and I'll collect those. And that's where the questions will come from for our panel discussion. So the content's provided by you guys, so please feel free. Anything that pops in your head, just jot that down, and we'll get that asked this afternoon, and that's kind of a fun way to involve the attendees. Also in your folder is an evaluation form for the conference. Please, 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 before you leave today, fill that out and leave it at the registration table. That helps us, as we organize this for next year, know what worked for you, what didn't work for you, things like that. So I'd appreciate it if you'd fill that out. All of you here hopefully appreciate evaluation research, right? So I hope. Okay, so if you have concerns or questions during the day, find me, stop by the registration table. We are excited you're here, and I look forward to a great day. The goal of the conference today is to gather professionals who have experience and unique perspectives on teacher evaluation and to get important conversations started. So it's with special excitement that I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond to our gathering. Linda is one of America's most well-known thinkers on teacher effectiveness and evaluation. She is the president and CEO of the Learning Policy Institute, the Charles E. Ducommun Professor of Education Emeritus at Stanford University, where she founded the Stanford Center for Opportunity Policy in Education and served as the faculty sponsor of the Stanford Teacher Education Program, which she helped to redesign. She currently serves as the chair of California's Commission on Teacher Credentialing. She is here today to speak to us about getting teacher evaluation right. And so, it is with great pleasure that I introduce our keynote speaker this morning, Dr. Linda Darling-Hammond.
Thank you very much. Let's see, testing, okay. we're wired for sound. It's a pleasure to be back here in Northern Ohio. This is my my own stomping grounds where I grew up, not too far away from here in Cleveland. And I always watch what's going on in Ohio with great interest, and it's wonderful to see colleagues that I've met over and over again here, as well as some new ones. This is a really important topic, and of course it's really a hot topic in this state. Ohio was one of the states that very early on got involved in the race to the top and waiver processes with the federal government to redesign teacher evaluation. And so Ohio has been a bellwether state, and I know there's a lot of work going on now to continue to refine what the state has been doing and to think forward about the next steps. So one of the things I want to use as a frame for this idea of getting teacher evaluation right is some thinking about what we mean by effectiveness today in the 21st century, where the fast rate of change, the way that knowledge is growing, the expectations from employers in the economy and so on are so rapidly changing. When I grew up in Cleveland, and some of you will relate to this from Toledo and other parts of the state, you could go with less than a high school education. You could go down to the steel mills, you could go down to the rubber factories, you could be in the auto parts work and get a good wage for, buy a house, raise a family, have a good job with very little education. Most of those jobs have moved overseas. Many of them have been automated. Robotics is going at a very rapid clip. I live in Silicon Valley. I see driverless cars in my neighborhood. All of this is happening at a very fast rate. The pace at which knowledge is growing is so exponential that most of our kids are going to work with knowledge that hasn't been invented yet or discovered yet, using technologies that haven't been created yet, working on problems that we have not managed to solve. Technology knowledge right now is doubling every 11 months, just as one example. So what we're looking at when we think about what schools need to do and what teachers need to do is different than it was in the 20th century. It's not so straightforward to say what is teacher effectiveness because it's not just getting through the book, covering the chapter, getting kids to memorize things so that they can spit them back. That's not going to prepare them for the work that they're going into and the world that they're going into. They're going to need to be able to find and inquire and amass information, put it together in new ways, figure out what it means, work with collaborators, and be able to learn themselves throughout their lives. Most people will have 10 jobs before they get into their 30s. The pace of change in the economy will be so rapid. So what do we mean by effectiveness? Many states have adopted new standards. They typically focus on what some people call deeper learning or 21st century skills. It means that we need to understand the meaning of ideas. Students have to be able to apply the ideas, the concepts, and the modes of inquiry to complex real-world tasks. to be able to transfer knowledge and skills to new situations, not just use it in the same way over and over again, to communicate ideas, to collaborate in problem solving, and then this, of course, ability to learn. So the pedagogies associated with this are different pedagogies than the ones associated with just sit and get. Of course, the demand for skills has changed substantially. There's been a huge increase in the demand for complex communication skills and higher order thinking, expert thinking, a huge decrease in the demand for routine skills. And the dilemma we have in education as we're seeking to sort of catch up is that the skills that are the easiest to teach and to test are also the ones that are the easiest to digitize, automate, and outsource. And that's what we're experiencing. So states are also changing their assessment systems, not fast enough in my view, but that's a whole nother conversation. And the expectations of teaching are changing. So what 21st century learning is not, you'll recognize this high school social studies teacher from Ferris Bueller, but a reminder, oops, our sound is not working. Sound guy. Are we ready? Okay.
Effort to alleviate the effects of the, the Great Depression passed the, a tariff bill, the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, which raised or raised tariffs in an effort to collect more revenue for the federal government. Did it work? Anyone know the effects? It did not work, and the United States sank deeper into the Great Depression.
And so did the kids. But that, we laugh about this, caricature. But this is a guy who knows his subject matter. Clearly, he knows about the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, and he says it out loud to kids. And that notion of teaching was actually the notion on which a lot of policy was built in the past, that you get somebody who knows their content who can say it out loud to kids. The kids are supposed to take notes, read the chapter, spit it back. So what kind of teaching are we now looking for? What do effective teachers do? And I want to give you an opportunity to think about that, because the teacher evaluation system ought to be capturing what effective teachers do. And we should think about that in relation to the teaching that we're doing. So I'm going to pull up a little video. This is Mary Edwards. She teaches in Detroit. She's a National Board Certified Science teacher. Take note as she goes along of what are some of the things that she's doing. Her teaching is highly effective. There's been a lot of study of what she's doing. What are some of the features that you see in this teaching that are associated with this effectiveness?
Right. We want to find out if it's true that the cellular membrane is permeable. Means it lets things in and out, right? So we're going to use an egg, okay, everyone? We're going to use an egg. You see in the classroom when I asked the students, how would you get the membrane initially? That a lot of them thought, well, I'll boil the egg. Because they took their past experiences, they boiled the egg, they peel it off, the membrane's right there. But I had to get them to understand that this is a living cell, and a living cell has cytosol. It has cytoplasm that surrounds the nucleus, so you can't do that. So what are you going to do?
Yeah, and it start cracking and it start peeling off. And then you ain't never burnt no egg, like hardwood eggs, like you do for Easter. Like hardwood eggs. Like, and after a while it starts to crack. Then it's more acidic. Okay. So it could be like lemon juice. I say vinegar.
And see, I had the students decide how to dissolve it. And then that made them interested. If I would have just said, okay, today...
Sorry? Oh, for some reason the video is not showing. Thank you. We're going to go back then so you can see it. Thank you for telling me.
You are going to dissolve the membrane of an egg in vinegar. They would have said, okay, today. And if I would ask them 2 days later, what did you dissolve? What acid did you use? They would say, I don't know, whatever you told us to. But see, now if I asked them, they would say vinegar, and I would say, why? Because the pH is low enough to dissolve the membrane, to dissolve the eggshell without affecting the membrane. So that's why I did that. A couple of the groups broke their egg accidentally. And they thought, oh, the experiment.
Let's figure this out. Thank you for, since I wasn't even turning around and looking, usually this works. Huh?
You may have to hit the PowerPoint slideshow
Right, okay.
in order to show the video.
All right, let's try that. It's worth the effort, so we're gonna persevere. That also ended the video.
It's now a disaster. But I wanted them to understand that happens to scientists, that there's limitations in life. But the scientific word is a limitation. What's the problem? What happened? What is this? You're a scientist.
Limitation.
Why is it a limitation?
Because all the membrane, all the shell was gone. Membrane is off.
Okay, exactly. What is this?
Let's go back and see a little bit of it, okay?
All right, can you describe the membrane?
It's rubbery.
We're scientists ourselves, right? We want to find out if it's true that the cellular membrane is permeable. Means it lets things in and out, right?
Okay, thank
So
you
we're going to
very
use an
much.
egg, okay, everyone? We're going to use an egg. You see in the classroom when I asked the students, how would you get the membrane initially? That a lot of them thought, well, I'll boil the egg. Because they took their past experiences, they boiled the egg, they peel it off, the membrane's right there. But I had to get them to understand that this is a living cell, and a living cell has cytosol. It has cytoplasm that surrounds the nucleus, so you can't do that. So what are you going to do?
And it start cracking and it start peeling off. And then you ain't never burnt no egg, like hardwood eggs, like you do for Easter. Like hardwood eggs. Like, and after a while it starts to crack. And it's more acidic. Okay. So it could be like lemon juice.
I say vinegar.
And see, I had the students decide how to dissolve it. And then that made them interested. If I would have just said, okay, today you are going to dissolve the membrane of an egg in vinegar, they would have said, okay, today. And if I would ask them 2 days later, what did you dissolve? What acid did you use? They would say, I don't know, whatever you told us to. But see, now if I asked them, they would say vinegar. And I would say, why? Because the pH is low enough to dissolve the membrane, to dissolve the eggshell without affecting the membrane. So that's why I did that. A couple of the groups broke their egg accidentally, and they thought, oh, the experiment is now a disaster. But I wanted them to understand that happens to scientists, that there's limitations in life. But the scientific word is a limitation. What's the problem? What happened? What is this? You're a scientist.
Limitation.
Why is it a limitation?
Because all the membrane, all the shell was gone for the membrane is off.
Were you okay? Exactly. What is this?
The membrane.
All right, let's look at it.
Yeah.
All right, can you describe the membrane?
It's rubbery, like almost as a balloon.
Absolutely. So if it's rubbery, does it have pores in it? But we can't see them. How can you prove there are pores in this?
Microscope.
All right, without a microscope, how could you prove in your scientific investigation that
Because
this
the vinegar got in.
it was a perfect opportunity for them to see the consistency of the membrane and to see they can't see the pores. They cannot see the pores, but they're microscopic. Well, they read that, or they learned that in some past experience that we've done, because I didn't lecture to that. So that was a learning experience for them. What happened?
It wrote way more.
It weighed more. Yeah. There you go. It weighed
Like a balloon.
You got it. Hey, look. They have to feel secure in making a mistake and not thinking that they're going to be ridiculed by me or the other students in the classroom, and they have to be able to take chances. I don't know everything, and the kids can ask me something, and if I don't know it and I tell them, I'm going to look it up, they feel more secure with me asking them questions and them not knowing the answers. But the best thing to do is to go around and catch it. Catch them while they're doing it and get them to think about it.
Okay, so what did you see in terms of the teaching practices that were going on there that were allowing kids to basically begin to master those 21st century skills that I just talked about? And these are the things that you would want your teacher evaluation system to be able to capture, right? So what did you see? Questioning, very skillful questioning, right? Highly scaffolded questioning. What else?
I love that she said, we're all scientists, or you're scientists yourselves.
So she's building an identity for them, right? She's building an identity as scientists, which we know has a lot to do with whether kids will actually then engage with the material. Yeah?
Well,
Yeah. And very skillfully done. Again, there was a lot of planning that went into that. And you can see the kids were experienced at that kind of cooperative learning. Yes?
Failure and iteration.
Say it again?
Failure and iteration.
Yes, so this idea that failure is part of the learning experience and you can learn from your mistakes. Very important sort of for the psychological environment of the classroom. What else? Yes?
In the moment. So the idea that everything is happening, and you have to go catch them doing whatever it is they're doing.
Yes. Exactly. Yes.
She waited and listened.
Yes.
I think that's sometimes the hardest. Because she knew the answer. She wanted them to discover the answer.
Right. So she wasn't telling it to them. She was enabling them to find it. And then looking for the opportunities to help them get there, and then drawing those connections through her questioning. Very tough to do, right? It's a very skillful pedagogy. What else? Yeah.
Organic, that it wasn't a scripted lesson. The kids came about it on their own without having to follow steps.
Right. Yeah, she didn't give them a canned lab. She gave them a problem and then a set of tools to answer it. Other? So those are some of the features. Yes? Yes, absolutely. So you think about teacher evaluation systems that we've seen based on a notion of teaching where you stand up, you talk to the students, you check for understanding, there's like a set of routines that don't capture this kind of classroom at all. In fact, I've seen in various iterations over the years. I started studying teacher evaluation in 1984. Times where a principal would walk into the room and see this kind of activity going on and say, oh, I'll come back when you're teaching. So, being sure that you can build the kind of instrumentation for teacher evaluation, the kind of framework, the kind of opportunity for understanding what's going on that allows for this kind of effective teaching is one of the challenges today as we're changing our goals for education. So we see that from the research, effective teachers engage students in active learning that builds on their experience. She talked about building on their experience a number of times, that, they've had this experience before and we build on it. Creating these kind of intellectually ambitious tasks like the one that you saw, using a variety of teaching strategies. She had lectured. She mentioned that she had lectured previously. Now they're doing their inquiry, so she's using different strategies. Assessing student learning, which she was doing in the moment to adapt the teaching to their needs. Lots of scaffolds that we saw in the way that she was approaching the task with the students. Supports for language and content learning, both. I learned a lot of vocabulary, academic language, just by listening to her talk about the cytosol and the cytoplasm, and a bunch of stuff that I completely forgot because I had to memorize it and spit it back on a test years ago and never fully understood. I could capture just from the way she approached this teaching. Constant feedback, opportunities for revising work is extremely important. One of the most largest effect sizes on student achievement is formative assessment, in which students get feedback about their work and they immediately apply it in revising or redoing or retaking an assignment or a test or a paper. And very often we don't have in our curriculum or our notions of teaching the idea that there will constantly be revision because that is actually the highest lever on gains and achievement. And then effectively managing a collaborative classroom in which students feel that they are members, and you certainly saw that in this example. So how do we develop and ensure this kind of effective teaching for every child? I started with this rather than teacher evaluation because a lot of times we talk about evaluation, we forget that it's about effective teaching. It's not about just procedures and, managing a bunch of processes. It's about helping teachers become more effective. And our systems for evaluation then need to be rooted in the teaching itself. First of all, it's important, if effective teaching is our goal, for leaders in schools to create conditions for effectiveness. One of them is to reduce churn. One of the things that has the greatest impact on student achievement is the amount of turnover in a school. The more churn there is, the lower the achievement, not only for the kids who've lost their teachers, but for other kids as well because of the discontinuities that exist. Building coherent curriculum and common norms and practices across classrooms actually enhances everyone's achievement. So these are practices that actually enable teachers to be more effective. You're not going to do it only through a teacher evaluation system. It has to be the whole set of conditions. Assigning teachers with some continuity in grade levels and courses that are appropriate to their expertise. Studies have found that teachers are more effective, at least if they have the opportunity to teach the same grade level or the same course for multiple years in a row. Now there comes a point where teachers want to change and expand and explore, but if they're going from the second grade one year to the kindergarten the next year to the fifth grade the next year, or from one set of courses 1 year to another set another year, it actually reduces their effectiveness. And it's kind of a no-brainer if you think about it. We all become more expert as we learn to do things with refinement, but assignment practices in schools do not always honor what we know about what enables teachers to be effective. High-quality mentoring for beginners boosts effectiveness. High-quality professional learning, including collaborative planning time, boosts effectiveness. So again, if our goal is effectiveness, teacher evaluation has to be in a system in which these other things are going on. Otherwise, you're not going to get the benefits from evaluation. Another piece of the puzzle in the United States, I just finished an international study which looked at 5 high-achieving countries, is that teachers need time to collaborate in their planning. Teachers in the U.S. teach the most instructional hours per week and per year of any teachers in the world. We are just ahead of Chile in that regard. The average teacher in the U.S. teaches 27 hours a week with kids. The average internationally among the OECD countries is 19. Think of what you would do with that extra 8 hours a week to be able to collaborate and plan and fine-tune lessons and do action research and lesson study and a variety of other things that would make you more effective. The corollary of having so much instructional time is having so little planning time. And one of the other things we know is that collaboration drives improvement. This is from the most recent OECD studies of the TALIS surveys, which were done internationally. And they found that looking at both PISA data and the survey data, that the more frequently teachers report participating in collaborative practices with their colleagues, the higher their level of self-efficacy, which is itself correlated with effectiveness and job satisfaction, and the more likely they are to use innovative practices. These reform-oriented practices that we just talked about are believed in by most teachers in the United States and internationally, but used by a tiny minority. And the odds of using those practices are much greater when teachers are in collaborative settings where they are working with one another to develop those practices. So I've spent this teacher evaluation talk talking about things that you might say are very little to do with teacher evaluation, but they have a lot to do with teacher effectiveness, which is in fact what we're trying to accomplish. So how do you put evaluation into a setting where it enables and intersects with the rest of the conditions that will allow teachers to be effective? Well, I'm going to talk about that as I sort of set the frame for agreeing that teacher evaluation was in need of revision. When I went to study teacher evaluation in 1984, I became the very first researcher to look at the peer assistance and review program that was started in Toledo. And it has since moved to some other districts in Ohio. How many of you know of or are in districts that are using some form of peer assistance and review? A small number of folks. Cincinnati, Columbus, Cleveland are other places. And we were looking for effective teacher evaluation practices, which was like looking for a needle in a haystack. It was very hard to find places where there was a robust approach to evaluation, to improvement, with the right kind of resources and so on. And there are lots of reasons why teacher evaluation has been problematic. First of all, we at moments in time have not had clear standards for practice. That has been changing in recent years. Time is always an issue, both for principals and for those who are involved in the assistance process, principals who are trying to get to all the classrooms, and then the assistance process. Expertise can be a real challenge, particularly in high schools. One of my favorite stories about teacher evaluation was from a French teacher who said, I always get a great evaluation because when the principal comes in, I say to my students in French, if you know the answer, raise your right hand. If you don't know the answer, raise your left hand. So as she asks the questions, the kids are all raising their hands, and everybody she calls on has the right answer. She always got a great evaluation. Of course, it's hard for a high school principal to be expert in all of the areas of the curriculum, but there are moments where we really need subject matter expertise, particularly at the points of tenure where you want to make a serious, solid decision about whether somebody continues in the profession with tenure, at moments where teachers may be struggling and need expert advice and counsel and assistance in their classroom. The expertise is really important, and we've often just said it's all up to the principal, and that's really not fair to have no resources. Links to professional development have often been absent. In the past, there was little attention to student learning and very unwieldy processes for making decisions, which sometimes involved, lawsuits and a variety of other things. We could, however, by reforming teacher evaluation, make matters even worse. One way that we can make matters worse is by focusing evaluation entirely after entry. Most of the countries that I visited spend a lot of time selecting teachers into teacher education, ensuring a high-quality, rigorous teacher evaluation, teacher education process with a high bar for both entry and exit. By the time, with strong mentoring when teachers get in the classroom, by the time they've been through all of that, teacher evaluation is not about catching people who are incompetent, because everybody who's made it through has demonstrated a level of competence. It's about just helping people improve. So we really need to be thinking about the whole continuum. We could make things worse by focusing on ranking teachers rather than improving teaching, and that can be particularly problematic given the importance of collaboration, where ranking against each other is actually detrimental rather than productive. By making decisions substantially based on value-added state test scores, there are good things about the notion of value-added and the notion of looking at student learning, but as I'll describe in a moment, the way in which state test scores have been used in this context has been problematic. Putting all the weight on school principals, who are very busy people and have to deal with, parents and the whole set of curriculum issues and school improvement issues. If there are needs for intensive assistance, the principal needs additional hands on deck. And then designing systems that cannot be implemented. Teacher qualifications do matter, and we do have substantial research that finds that student learning gains are related to teachers coming in with a strong academic background, with quality preparation prior to entry, with certification in the field they teach, with experience, and we also, in some states like North Carolina, have evidence about national board certification. In combination, one study found these 5 variables predict more of the difference in student learning gains than race and parent education combined. So one of the things we ought to be doing is having policies that focus on getting us to a place where all of these things are in place. Instead, what we have is high variability in the United States across these dimensions, and the kids who get teachers who have more of these features are the more advantaged students. Less advantaged students are much less likely to have continuous, experienced teachers with all of these variables. Again, then that feeds into the effectiveness that teachers can have later. So I'm going to suggest 10 standards or 10 principles for teacher evaluation. You can get a hold of my PowerPoint if you want it. I'm glad to share it with John, and it can go out to the attendees, so don't worry about trying to grab every word as I go along. But I think one of the first things, and we see this in other countries as well, is that it's important to start with standards. The National Board for Professional Teaching Standards began in 1987 to certify accomplished teachers. Those standards have traveled the whole world, and in these countries that I just studied, they all have versions of these standards now that they borrowed from the US. The in-task standards for beginning teachers were adopted by most states, including Ohio. And evidence shows that in the best context, the same standards would inform the entire career. So that what is shaping the standards in teacher education and induction and professional learning and evaluation would all be connected in some way along a continuum, so that teachers are continually refining a set of skills rather than shifting lenses and gears. And evidence shows that the performance assessments that are associated with national board certification, the portfolios, as well as those derived from the national board, the PACT in California, the TPA, are related to teacher effectiveness in producing student learning gains. So if you embed these kinds of assessments and standards in a system, you can begin to help teachers think about what they're aiming for, get a common language for teaching among the assessors and the teachers, and create a continuum across the career. Thinking and acting systemically is important. Having the standards and the methods for recruiting, selecting, inducting, mentoring, developing teachers be connected and interactive and based on the same standards is really important. A lot of times policy comes in and districts do this because it happened, somebody brought that in, then something else comes in at another time and they have that thing. Very rarely do people get a chance to step back and say, how does this all fit together? Is the way that we're recruiting people, the way that we're mentoring them, the way that we're evaluating them in sync? Creating coherence so that teacher evaluation is part of a teacher development system, which is also handled in conjunction with leadership training, is really, really important. In fact, if you want to improve teaching, the most important starting place is to improve leadership. To ensure that principals know, and other leaders in districts know what good teaching is, are skilled at helping to develop teaching and professional development for teachers, can understand and use the tools of the evaluation process, and are themselves being evaluated on how well they support teaching, so that there's coherence in the whole system. And if you can get a cadre of school leaders who have those capacities, then the effectiveness of teachers will improve because they will have those supports. The fourth is to focus on performance. And I mentioned the work of the National Board and some of the offshoot assessments where teachers are asked in those assessments to plan a unit of instruction, to teach and be videotaped teaching, to analyze and assess student learning, to reflect on the success of practice and how it can be improved. If you can do those things, and we're now bringing teachers in through pre-service if they are encountering Ed TPA, and we're giving teachers opportunities later in the career if they're engaging with national board certification. If you can help teachers begin to be reflective in that way, you've already made a huge dent in the way that teachers continually drive their own effectiveness, right? Because that reflection process, that ability to look at whether kids are learning in relation to my teaching is the holy grail of teacher effectiveness. I can remember many teachers, maybe you can too, who just did the same thing day after day, week after week, as they had done last year and the year before. They taught us, they told us stuff, they told us to read things and answer questions, they lectured, but they had no they had no way of evaluating, and actually no disposition or skills to evaluate whether we were learning in relation to their teaching, and to design their teaching with respect to our learning. And it's actually a pretty recent strategy in teaching to kind of include these cycles of inquiry. But if you can plant those, not only in entry to the profession, in encouragements for board certification, but in the evaluation process itself, you're getting an engine for teacher improvement. Some states, Ohio is one of them, are beginning to think about how those tiers of teacher assessment can be part of the state system as well as the local system, with a beginning teacher performance assessment, a professional license assessment, and board certification. New Mexico does something like that as well, and other states are looking at it. And then, with all of that surround, you can build an integrated system of evaluation in the classroom. And I've taken this time about that surround because if you just go for a teacher evaluation system in the classroom and you're not doing any of those other things, you're not going to get strong gains in teacher effectiveness just from an instrument that people use to go into the classroom or a set of tools that they use for that. So what do we need in an integrated system? We need standards-based measures of practice, ways to look at teaching, connected to evidence of collegial contributions, and connected to measures of student learning in some fashion in a way that is integrated. And I noticed that the new recommendations of OTES about changes in the Ohio system are now looking to integrate what is looked at in terms of my practice, my evidence of student learning in relation to the practice, and then my contributions to the learning of others. I will come back to this, but I include evidence of collegial contributions because there is so much evidence that collaboration among teachers both predicts student achievement in schools and predicts the growth of teacher effectiveness over time in those schools. That if we think of teacher evaluation only as individual, without thinking about how teachers are encouraged to help each other, we're missing a large bet. And in the other countries that I've just recently studied, Singapore, Finland, China, Australia, and Canada, collaboration is always evaluated in individual teacher evaluation, and it's a major part of it. They're also looking to identify talents of teachers to be able to create leadership pipelines and being able to contribute to the welfare of the school as a whole, and to row in the boat together is part of that piece. So once we get to the place where we're looking at practice, one of the other things we've discovered is that standards-based observation by experts, using these kinds of standards we've talked about, and coming in and giving feedback around the standards regularly, does also increase teacher effectiveness. A bunch of studies by folks like Tony Milanowski and others have documented this. So the regular offering of feedback around a set of standards can be very powerful in and of itself. But it's true that what teachers do, and think about the great teachers you know, and some of you are great teachers yourself, it's not just about what you do in the classroom. It's about how what you do on a certain day relates to what came before and what's going to come after. So looking at the arc of curriculum planning, looking at what kind of work are students doing. Are they doing thinking work that is tapping higher order thinking skills? What kind of feedback are you giving? So some systems now look at, will draw samples of work from students, or will include that in a teacher portfolio. There are practices that occur outside of the classroom, like that teacher who will, grab the students who need help at lunchtime, make sure that they come in after school, pick up the phone and call the parents, work with the colleagues to say, what are you doing with Johnny? I'm having struggles. Do you know something I could benefit from? Those practices also matter, and so not ignoring them is an important part of building a sense of what teachers really do and what they should focus on. And then increasingly people are using feedback from parents and from students as part of the system. And I will say that the evidence over the last 40 years of studies on student surveys as input into teachers' knowledge of how they're doing shows that students are actually more reliable than administrators in evaluating teachers as a general rule. And so there are things to be cautious about in using those data, but there is also some value. When I was teaching high school English, which is how I came into the profession, we didn't have student surveys, but I used them for myself, and they were very, very helpful to me in improving my teaching. When I got to higher education, it is required that your students evaluate you, and everybody posts all of these things, and I find it extremely helpful in that context as well. And we can talk about, what do you do with little kids and all the rest of it, but there are ways to blend those data. The other piece is to use multiple measures to assess student learning. And I think of this as a basket of evidence, and I think the direction that the OTES recommendations go could lead you in this direction. Those could include authentic assessments of learning from the classroom, like essays or research projects, investigations, portfolios. Important that those kinds of measures of higher order thinking and performance skills find their way into evaluation, because if all we do is look at the results of multiple choice tests, then we're not actually encouraging people to teach to the higher order thinking skills. Rand Corporation did a study of the state tests a few years ago, and 98% of the items on math tests were lower level skills. Only 2% were higher order thinking skills. Only 20% on English language arts tests were higher order thinking skills. So the tools we use and the measures we use are important. Now, there are also tests that could fit into a basket of evidence. What's useful for a given teacher, local, state, national tests. You can have pre and post test measures. If you're teaching advanced placement, then you might care about the AP test. If you're teaching International Baccalaureate, you care about the results on those. If you're an elementary teacher, you might be tracking developmental reading assessments over time. English proficiency gains could be there. Accomplishment of students' learning goals on their IEPs could be there. Documentation of learning could be there. And it should be set to the goals that teachers have that they're trying to improve on, and then measures of practice that are associated with those. I want to spend a minute on getting value from value added, because it's been a big issue in Ohio and in other states. And I am a researcher who uses a lot of value-added analyses of programs and interventions of various kinds in large data sets. And it's helpful because it measures progress rather than status. It's very helpful in researching practices and programs. There are, however, limitations for the use of value-added in individual teacher evaluation. One of the big challenges is the design of state tests, because under No Child Left Behind and still under ESSA, they can only measure grade level standards. That means that kids who are already performing above grade level do not have items to show their growth. Kids who are performing well below grade level do not have items to show their growth on the tests, and they only measure a narrow part of the curriculum. It is also very difficult in individual teacher evaluation to completely eliminate other influences on student learning. So on the point about grade level tests cannot measure growth for many students, if you think of the tested content as that little box in the middle there, and the rest of the curriculum as being that big domain that I've just put up there. And then you think about the fact that, let me go back, that if this is the 7th grade test and you're teaching kids who are in an advanced course or well below, that the tested content is not going to capture what they know and where they go. You can see what the challenge is. This is from a school where I have done a lot of work. And just to give you a sense of how many kids may or may not be at grade level, this is their 9th graders. They had 9th graders coming in who were reading at everywhere from the kindergarten level to the 12th grade level. And it's an urban school, not different from many others. There were only 6 kids out of the 64 who were reading on grade level. So a grade level test used to measure their achievement gains would be reasonably accurate for those 6 kids, or maybe, if you add the ones on either side, turns out there were none on either side of that grade level, but if there were, there might be a dozen kids that you could get some sense of the gains. But for all the rest of those kids, the grade level test is not going to tell you about their gains. Now, we used to have tests before No Child Left Behind that were on a longer continuum, but the federal law put us in the situation where we no longer have that. So that's a challenge, because that value-added measure is not going to be accurate for a large number of kids. In addition, many things influence achievement gains. This is from a study that Dan Goldhaber did some years ago, but Rick Hanushek has published a more recent version that is very, very similar. Typically, we find that the variance in achievement controlling for prior achievement is predicted 60% by student background factors, The school portion of it is about 40%. The teacher portion is about 8% in this particular case. Other classroom and school level factors come into play. Teacher effectiveness, when we measure value-added gains, we're measuring all these things, but we're calling it teacher effectiveness. But all of this is in there. Furthermore, 95% of the school classroom and teacher effects were unobservable. That is, they couldn't be controlled with specific variables. So we're not able to fully control for the things that predict the differences. So one of the things that we found, I was an early advocate for value-added teacher evaluation because I thought the concept makes sense. Of course you want to know how teachers contribute to student learning. But studies started coming out, and we did a study at Stanford ourselves showing how unstable the results were. I was in charge of a study and of selecting teachers where we were going to look at teachers who appeared to be highly effective based on the 4 different value-added models that we were using. And my colleague was the head of the National Board on Testing and Assessment, very skilled and knowledgeable statistician. So we had our models. And then we were going to look at the practices of ineffective teachers to see what the difference was. So I was in charge of putting teachers in the basket of effective or ineffective, and I'd start sorting all the data out and so on, because it was going to be a blind observation, as they say. And I would find a teacher who was highly effective one year and then ineffective the next year. Highly effective in one class and ineffective in another class. And this is now showing up in studies all across the country. We went the further step to figure out what was causing this instability. But just to give you an example from a study by Tim Sass in 5 urban districts, of the teachers who were in the top quintile in one year, they got sort of an A by being in the top 5th, half of them were getting a C, D, or F in the second year. They were in the bottom half. And of the teachers who were in the bottom quintile, they got an F in year 1, half of them were in the top half in year 2. So we see many, many, many studies where teachers are just bouncing around like crazy, where it's just very different. And it cannot be the teacher's effectiveness that's changing, right? I mean, if you're an effective teacher, you're going to be reasonably effective from year after year. Not that many teachers are going to just fall off the wagon or get religion and get on the wagon. So there's something about the measure that is challenging. And so when we looked at this in our case, here's an example. Maria, in year 1, she was in the bottom decile, and in year 2, she was in the top decile. She was in the same high school in both years, same course, not a beginning teacher. We controlled for prior achievement, demographics, school fixed effects. What differed, and we had all of the demographics like special ed status, English learner status, even gradations of levels of English learners, prior achievement, etc. But what differed in those 2 years was that she had 60% of her class as English learners in year 1, and only about 5% in year 2, very many more low-income students in the first year and so on. So the demographics of the class changed, and we found that as we looked at the models and changes in rankings, the demographics of the class, even though we were controlling for those, still bled over and had an effect. And I think partly that is the intersection with the psychometrics of the fact that their gains are not even being measured on the grade level test because of the phenomenon I told you about before. Enough of that technical stuff. What do we do about it? Well, one of the things we could do is use multiple measures to assess student learning. So Maria could have used in her basket of evidence the English language proficiency gains, a different assessment that is statewide, because that would have measured what her English learners were actually progressing in. She could have used her school had something called the qualitative reading inventory, which is on a K through 12 continuum, and she could have used those gains, which are then really spread out over the grades. She could have even used an authentic piece of work that they do in that school. They do an autobiography paper with multiple drafts, and you could imagine drawing artifacts with teacher feedback as a part of the portfolio. They do scored writing samples in the school from fall to spring. She could have measured gains fall to spring on the writing samples. Those pieces of evidence tied to her actual work in the classroom with the kids might have been part of a basket of evidence. One of the examples of how invalid metrics mismeasure teachers is another case from New York. Carolyn Abbott, this is a true story. These are the examples of comments from students on the left and from parents on the right. I'm sorry, it was parents on the left and students on the right. A beloved teacher, young teacher, parents said she's a great teacher, fabulous, my son never learned more math, one of my daughter's favorite teachers. Students, I love Miss Abbott, she's an amazing teacher. I've been looking forward to having her since the 4th grade. She got the worst scores in the city on the 8th grade value-added measures. So what happened? Well, she was actually teaching the same kids in 7th and 8th grade. They were in a school for gifted students. They scored at the 98th percentile in 7th grade. So in order to get much value added, you'd have to get above 100%. There's not a lot of room to grow. By 8th grade, she was teaching them the 10th grade curriculum. And they took Regents tests. All of her kids passed the 10th grade Regents test. A third of them passed with perfect scores. Most of them took it before the end of the year. You're allowed to take it in January or June. Clearly a highly effective teacher. But there are no items on the 8th grade state test that measure the 10th grade curriculum. And her gains with her students, who were already maxed out at the ceiling, could not show up. So she actually looked like the worst teacher in the city when she was one of the best. She was not allowed to stay in teaching because they had a rule in New York that if you did not show high value-added gains on the state test and you weren't allowed to use any other measures, you couldn't get tenure. So she went off and got a PhD in mathematics at Michigan, and I hope she's teaching in math ed at this point. What could we have done about Carolyn? Well, for one thing, she was teaching the Regents tests. Why didn't they use the Regents exam outcomes in her basket of evidence? You could even do a fall pretest with the Regents exam materials if you want to show the gains. She was focusing in her work on how to teach quadratic equations better. She could have used a pre and post test for the unit on quadratic equations linked to her own goals for herself for improvement and tied that in with her evaluator. I'm going to try these new strategies. I'm going to use this as one of my measures. She could have used scores and work samples from their 8th grade math science inquiry project, which they were working on in the school. She could have used student surveys of attitudes about math because that was a focus for her department in that year, was to get kids feeling better about math, which we know actually predicts their likelihood of staying in math longer and achieving more in math. The point is that the work that teachers are doing has to feed into the evidence about their students' learning. And while there are some values that can be, for some teachers, that can be taken from state level tests, there are also national level tests like the AP, there are local level assessments that are relevant that should feed into a thoughtful system of evaluation that helps teachers improve. Student learning objectives are another way that folks have worked on this problem, where you assemble learning evidence to assess progress. Those can actually include a variety of kinds of assessments, from classroom tests or rubric scored tasks, various kinds of assessments. The American Institutes of Research have worked on this to a substantial extent. I noticed that AIR was involved in working with the Ohio Standards Board and thinking about new strategies for the Ohio teacher evaluation system. This is something that could be brought in. In my book, Getting Teacher Evaluation Right, I talked about Hillsdale High School as one approach where you bring this goal setting together. Teachers work with the principal to set specific goals around 2 of the state standards. They write a self-evaluation as well as getting an evaluation from the principal. They set goals, and then they decide on student learning evidence that they're going to collect around those goals. And there's an observations of practice and collection of evidence about learning that is going on throughout the year in an iterative way. There's like a Google Doc, and the observations get recorded there, and then the evidence of practice from tests in the classroom or work products in the classroom, as well as they do district-wide tests in this particular district in each of the high school subjects. So various sources of evidence, but linked to their goals, which is part of an ongoing conversation with the principal. The 8th area is to develop effective processes, and I mentioned the peer assistance and review system earlier that has been used in some Ohio districts, where where there's a panel of teachers and administrators who oversee the evaluation system. They select master teachers who are available to mentor beginning teachers and teachers who are struggling. Teachers who are struggling are identified, and they get intensive assistance and they can self-identify, they can be identified by the principal or by colleagues. They get weekly intensive assistance from a mentor in their subject area, as do beginning teachers. All of that feeds into a system by the end of that year about continuation and renewal for those teachers. If they've improved, typically about half the teachers who have that kind of support improve sufficiently by the end of the year to be back into the regular system, and about half retire or leave or are counseled out. But because all the due process is in place, there's no litigation, there's no long process beyond that. What is important is that the evaluation system should be able to handle both the needs of teachers who need intensive assistance, so that that's done effectively, so that it can be freed up otherwise to also just be developmental for the rest of the teachers. We shouldn't be running in every year to see if teachers who've been competent for a long time are still competent, this year. I mean, people can fall off the wagon, but, generally speaking, we should have systems to assist the principal in giving the assistance to teachers who need it. Links to high-quality professional development are very important. One review of experimental studies found that student achievement increased by 21 percentile points among programs that offered the right kinds of extended professional development. And the one-shot workshops that are so common had no positive effects. Some of you will have heard this statement. I heard it when I was a teacher years ago. When I die, I hope it's at a faculty meeting or in teacher in service, because the transition from life to death would be so subtle. So if we want this to work, we really do need a paradigm change. And in fact, we just did a study at the Learning Policy Institute where we reviewed 35 studies that found positive effects on student achievement of teacher professional development. And then we looked at what were the features of those 35 programs of professional development. So they were changing from the old sit and get, drive by, one size fits all, sort of spray and pray, disconnected from teachers' classrooms and their students. And we found 7 features that were present in what was interesting is that in these 35 programs, almost all of them had all 7 features. And in the ones where they weren't present, it was just because the study didn't look at or identify whether it was present. So they were content focused, the content that teachers are teaching. Active learning, collaborative, teachers working with colleagues. They used models and modeling, that is, teachers got to see models of what they were trying to learn to do, and there were exemplars of curriculum units, student work, as well as teaching practices. Coaching and mentoring were connected to the professional development as people try to put it into practice. Lots of opportunities for feedback and reflection, and then continual cycles of inquiry and improvement, and sustained over time. So I mentioned peer assistance and review as another feature of that. And the final point I want to make is that teacher evaluation should figure out how to emphasize collaboration because of its powerful effects on teacher effectiveness and learning. AIR pointed out that student learning evidence can be used in teams with school-wide, subject level, grade level, team-based goals, and in a goal setting and inquiry cycle, so that teacher evaluation does not only have to be individual. And in fact, we see in Long Beach, I describe this in my book, that they do use individual, grade level, department teams, and schools set goals. Teacher evaluation is embedded in this process that is both individual and collective. They use multiple sources of evidence. This is what's in their collective bargaining agreement about the sources of evidence, this long list that's here, that can be used both by individuals to evaluate progress for students, by teams and departments, and by the school as a whole. And they do an annual review of the evidence at all of those levels. And then they jointly make decisions about how to meet students' needs. So often it's the most highly effective teachers, the most experienced teachers, who will then volunteer to take more of the special education students next year, or to pave the way with colleagues for a new curriculum plan that's going to be put in place. And that's done as people collaboratively figure out how to improve. You can't do this if you're pitting teachers against each other. If you're ranking all the teachers on a scale and saying, who's better than whom, then your gain is my loss, rather than us collaboratively working together. In New Mexico, I describe the approach at South Valley Academy. They have that 3-tiered portfolio-based licensing system at the state. Inside schools, linked to the state system is a professional development plan strategy that's used for goal setting and collaborative work. It's a sort of practitioner action research model. One of the examples I give there is a teacher, young teacher named Andres, who wanted to improve vocabulary learning in chemistry. He set some measurable goals. He identified with his peers a variety of strategies. He collected outcome measures. The peers helped him figure out what outcome measures he could also use. He ended up with 14 artifacts about student learning evidence in his portfolio with his analysis of the student learning related to the strategies. And when he reflected on this, he noted that because they worked on their professional development plans together as a faculty, that the collaborations were the most powerful and useful part of the process. The staff became aware of many learning gaps we noticed in our students. We began working collaboratively to find ways to address the learning gaps. Many staff members noticed things that I hadn't noticed before, but I was like, yeah, that's happening with my students too. In many of the meetings, teachers together started noticing trends. Having a forum to share effective strategies for student learning opens the door for every teacher at the school to help every other teacher get better. This all happened as part of the teacher evaluation process, because personal development plans were discussed and supported in the group. One last example, a colleague in Santa Clara, California, Lynn Formigli, who is a science teacher, they had a part of their evaluation process where teams could join together and set goals as a team. So she was a science teacher working with writing teachers and English teachers to improve student writing. And so she said, in my continuing struggle to improve student writing, I teamed up with the 7th and 8th grade writing teacher. They spent time observing each other. They met and compared their observations. They came up with specific ways to improve student writing and integrating it throughout all of the grade levels and subject areas. They observed other teachers, helped me to understand how important modeling is, allowing me to overcome my fear of giving students the answers when I give them examples. Ultimately, what they figured out is if they could have common tools for writing across the school, that they could help everybody improve, and that's what they did. So the whole school benefited from her teacher evaluation process, and the principal was ecstatic about this. He said it's so beneficial at the middle school level when we see a common strand run through the instructional day. When something in science is tied to something in English, both make more sense, and that's what Lynn, Lourdes, and Sarah created. The reflection process that they went through was an evaluation supervision highlight for me. We spoke about the writing process, genres, cross-grade and cross-subject education, and a host of other things. And ultimately, the writing practices across the entire school were revised because this team of teachers said we want to improve our practice in this area. And they had plenty of evidence of student learning to look at and to guide their practice at reflection. So, to sum up, if we take teaching effectiveness seriously, not just teacher evaluation, but the goal of teacher evaluation is teacher effectiveness, we would do a number of things in addition to and in our teacher evaluation. We would create teaching conditions that support success for students and teachers, high quality mentoring for beginners, sustained practice-based collegial learning opportunities for all educators. We would design schools so that they could have a coherent, thoughtful curriculum in which teachers are planning together. And then we would plant in there evaluation systems that are standards-based, that integrate practice and outcome data rather than treating them separately, that link to coaching and professional development, that are rigorous at the point of tenure and other key junctures, and that are designed then to provide the assistance and the due process and the timely decisions that we need. I'm painting a broad canvas here because I think it's so important as we tackle these very huge challenges that we're all tackling to bring our schools into the 21st century and to enable teachers to do things they were never asked to do before, that we support teachers in every part of the work. And that, as some teachers find, teacher evaluation becomes a helpful, joyous experience where learning is together and goal setting, documenting student learning, and improving practice are part of the quest that all teachers are on to serve their students better. Thank you for your role in that.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Darling-Hammond. So we're going to get started now with the breakout sessions. Like I said before the speech, a couple of things. Number one, please feel free to write some questions on those index cards, leave them on your table. We'll collect those. Also, if you wanted to purchase a book or have a book signed, that'll be going on for just a few minutes now until the presentations get started at 10 a.m. Yeah, and find me if you have any questions. Thank you all for coming, and let's have a great day.
Good. What is this? This is for all right. Let's test the audio. Check, check, check. Check, check, check. You getting audio levels? Okay. Do it again. I got both. Check, check, check. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10.
but actually this study took place in Washington, D.C. I studied in one charter school, and I know that charter schools are kind of bound by different laws and regulations in terms of not having unions. So a lot of what I have to say, is even more difficult to implement in a public school system or statewide. I don't know what your union restrictions are here in Ohio, but I'll go ahead and get started. So, as we know, my study kind of starts at this juncture where we started with this idea that teacher quality is really important. Of course, teachers and principals have known that all along, but that teachers can impact students' short and long-term learning. But then there was this kind of immediate disagreement about what does teacher quality mean? How do we measure that teacher quality? Which led to finding all of these tools and practices that are valid and reliable, and that's kind of what we've adopted at this point. But then there was this other deep divide that came across where some researchers and practitioners saw a great value in looking at human capital benefits of evaluation tools, using them summatively to decide about teacher tenure, to decide about retention, and hopefully this continuing shift right now to really look at teacher learning benefits. How can we use teacher evaluation tools to kind of formatively inform teacher learning over time? So that's where I kind of came into my study. This is based on my dissertation research, is how can schools use teacher evaluation data to drive the teacher learning policy within their school, to change the outcomes for teachers so that it's a meaningful process, right? This is kind of off the screen a little bit. So this is kind of where it started for me. We have this kind of split between summative uses and formative uses, just as kind of an aside. Scriven, who came up with these terms of summative and formative, and as practitioners, we have used them a lot with student data, evaluating students summative and formatively, but he actually came up with these terms originally for evaluating teachers, and then it was kind of adopted. But this whole idea that data can be used in these two different ways. For summative data, we're looking, again, incentive pay, formative data, using data formatively, I should say, because it's the same data, but linking it to professional development. And there are these very different views associated about teachers, whereas a summative view of data would imply that teacher skill sets do not change over time. A formative view of data would imply that teachers continually learn new skills and can build expertise over time. So I came in with a very formative view of teacher evaluation, looking to find a school that was using data in that way and supporting teachers with the hope of really learning a lot about how to build a formative evaluation system. My view kind of changed over time, and I'll talk about that later, but I think it is a good place to start. So I'm wondering, by studying a school with a strong commitment to formative evaluation data, what can we learn about school level factors that support teacher use? And when schools are using data in this way, what is that teachers gain from it? What do they actually learn? Does it influence their practice, and how so? So the really difficult part about this was actually finding a case that was using teacher evaluation data in a formative way. So, I knew from the research, what is that supposed to look like? That, administrators are trained really well, that there are frequent teacher evaluations, that this is not just based on a small snapshot of practice, that there's professional development linked to it. A lot of this was based on Zepeda's model of formative feedback. So I know what it's supposed to look like, but I really had a hard time finding a school that even professed to do this. And I even went as far as to talk to one of the largest professional development associations related to teacher evaluation, who gave me some schools to talk to, went to talk to those schools who also said, listen, we don't do this. Like, we want to do this, we don't do this. But kind of happened upon this really great school in Washington, D.C., where the administrator talked about really great practices that they were doing. So we'll talk about those practices in just a minute. But I thought that, based on what I found, example we're getting for formative use of the data, that it kind of drove the rest of my analysis of the data. I'm not going to read everything. I've just highlighted some of the key aspects of what was going on in the classroom. But here was a teacher, and I should kind of step back to say that this teacher actually noticed. She had 5 years of experience at another school. She came in as a kindergarten teacher and noticed that her students were leaps and bounds beyond where her kindergartners were for the past 5 years at another school in the same city in Washington, D.C. as well. So I am expecting, as a 5-year veteran teacher, I'm going to walk in and these are the things that my students need to learn. But she walked in, she put up her morning message, and students were reading the morning message, and she thought, oh, I thought I was going to teach you the A sound this week. I guess I have to scrap this whole lesson, right? So notice right away that I'm not where I need to be as a teacher. And the really great thing was she felt very safe in this environment, that the administrators had already built in, even though it was just 2 weeks into school, that this is a safe place to take risks as a professional, which is definitely necessary if you want to set up this formative feedback system. And you can come to us if you need support. And so she went to her evaluator and she said, help me. I'm not doing what I need to do. So this was a very safe place. What did the evaluator do? Didn't say, you know what, work on this, I'll come back and check on you. Paired me up with another teacher, did some observations of other teachers in the building, sent me to offsite PDs, and then the evaluator came in with her on a Saturday. I know not everybody wants to be there on a Saturday, but just the point that she helped me dissect my entire lesson plan, made sure that I would be ready to teach on Monday, came in to do a model lesson for me on Tuesday, then watched me again on Wednesday. So just to give a very structured support. Created resources with me, walked me through how the lesson would look. So it was a different approach to professional development. Again, this administrator only has 6 teachers that she's solely responsible for helping with growth. And so she could dedicate all of this time to this teacher. And so the teacher felt supported to incorporate more rigorous aspects to her lesson.
I have a good question.
Yeah.
And when you say that they have 6, how many administrators do they have? And what was the enrollment? That seems like an amazing step. What does that look like?
Right. I think that it was amazing. So when I say 6, I'm talking about the formative evaluation system. So they had 3 core administrators that had to do those 3 yearly summative and give them to the state, right, which was the principal and 2 vice principals. It was a pre-K to 8 school. Pre-K didn't require those 3 formatives, only K to 8. So they had the elementary and middle school vice principals and then the head principal. And so they divided those 3 yearly. But then with the director of special education, they had a math coach, they had a language arts coach, and they were an IB school, so they had an IB coach. And so that's 7 of them. I'm missing somebody, I think. Anyway, 7 administrators, and they divided the teaching staff. I think the staff was probably, I'm not sure exactly the number of teachers that were on the staff, but it worked out that they had about 6 to 7 each, and that was for the formative coaching. So you might have been, let's say you were a middle school math teacher, your person might not have been the principal, it would have been the math coach, let's say.
So it's more like a mentoring system. This is what it looks like to me.
Right.
But they just kind of put it under the umbrella of evaluation system, because like I said, the mentoring is really key.
Right, absolutely. But it wasn't, so they were using the same tool, they were using their same rubric during these mentoring systems, the goals were based there. It all kind of tied in together, and it wasn't peer-to-peer mentoring, it was the administrators that were doing this work. But again, the summative was kind of separate from the formative. Okay. We kind of talked about this already. This growth orientation was the second thing that came out. So teachers talked a lot about them being open to their suggestions. You know, I came and I said, we should do this with the evaluation system, and they kind of took it seriously. And they sought out data. They surveyed their teachers twice a year, and part of the survey talked about the teacher evaluation system. And if something wasn't going well, they were looking for not just this didn't go well, but what are some procedures I can put in place so that this can continue to go well, or I can change the way that this goes. And different ways to make it easier. All right. I'm going to kind of skip through this just because I'm running low on time, but this is one example of something they did to make the whole system easier, which is because they had different caseloads, they put this all in a Google tracking system so that if I'm the principal and I'm responsible for Ms. A's or Teacher A's final summative evaluation, I can also track what the math coach has been doing with her all year so that I have an idea when I'm doing my summative evaluation, you know, how is this teacher doing with reflecting? How is this teacher doing with growth? Or if I'm popping in, again, as principal, and I can pop into any teacher at any time, what has she been working on with the math coach, and how can I support that growth further? They had these teacher binders that were linked to growth. So the teacher previously kind of talked about having those 3 goals. And then they would pull these binders every week to talk about their post-observation meetings, and it would relate back to their 3 goals. So any assessments that related to those 3 goals, student assessments, they had observation forms. They were expected to observe other teachers' classrooms weekly, and they had actual formal observation forms of what that would look like and what they could look for. Because a lot of times we tell teachers, oh, go observe, you know, so-and-so down the hall, she's really good at routines, but I don't really know, especially as a new teacher, what am I really looking for? So these forms were structured to help teachers to know what to look for when you go into another classroom, and then, again, build that common language. And then new programs and procedures, like we talked about those Monday meetings with the instructional team. They would decide what the instructional focus is. One thing that they did is they selected guided reading as kind of a school-wide support. They noticed that a lot of teachers were having trouble with that during their walkthroughs. And they decided, you know, we're going to bring in this guided reading coach, and that came out of their teacher evaluation data. And then they integrated this new program. All right, so what came out? The thing is, so I said that I kind of started at this summative, we can use it summatively, we can use it formatively, but over time, my view of the data kind of changed, and my view of teacher evaluation kind of changed. And it started here, where I was noticing that some teachers were getting a lot more out of it, even though they're having these weekly meetings, and they get a lot of support. Novice teachers are getting a lot. They're saying, this was really great for me. Proactive teachers who could, like the one we talked about, oh, I need help with this, or self-reflective teachers who could say, this specific aspect of my classroom is what I need support with, give me resources. We're getting so much out of it. But teachers that needed help kind of outside of what the rubric was looking for, or outside of what the administrator was able to give help on, really weren't being served well, even in a system that was providing weekly feedback, even in a system that was providing resources and everything like that. So it kind of threw me, because I thought, if I find a system that does formative, this is going to be great. For the ones that did well, and I should step back and say, actually, I'll get back to that in a second, I'm sorry. Overall, there was this professional safety, which we kind of talked about before. Teachers felt safe. They referred to evaluation as a welcome presence, which I've never seen in any other school. Because administrators were in the room so often, and teachers felt like they were coming in to help them and support them, not to judge them. They felt very safe with what administrators were doing overall. And it supported teachers' teachers' commitment to urgency in the classroom, commitment to student growth. The teacher evaluation system supported that because there was so much transparency about practice and so much expectation of improvement, not only for students but for teachers, that if I engage with this over time, I'll get better. That it supported those cultural aspects and helped the school to kind of reculture, which was great. And teachers talked a lot about buying in. You know, this is really fair. My administrator knows what's going on in my classroom. If I have a problem, I can be involved. We talked about it together. And they talked about the rubric as kind of a lived document. We've talked about it so much, I don't even need to look at this piece of paper anymore. I know what it says. We do this practice in our school. Another important lesson that comes out is sustaining the leadership. So what happened in this school the third year, so they kind of built this homegrown system. Second year, everything went really, really, really well. Third year, the two vice principals that built this system together left to other schools within the district. So now I have two new leaders who come in. They're great leaders, right? They've done their training, they have their certifications, they're really committed to students, they want to make change. When they think teacher evaluation, they think walk in 3 times a year, give them a write out, sit down with them, right? They have no idea what's expected of them, and there was no effort, and I don't want to say no effort, but it wasn't strongly enough communicated to these new leaders what was expected, right? Especially when I'm doing something completely different from what was done in any other school. The second thing, so I found this picture kind of helpful because I have in my mind as an administrator what I'm looking for, but my job is to communicate that to other people, and that's not what was happening. This actually comes from other work that I did with another colleague on coaching, but we thought that this was really helpful for teacher evaluation too, which is kind of have to frame the work, not only for teachers, but also for new leaders coming in, and take some time to think through, when I say teacher evaluation, what does that mean? And if this is going to be a formative teacher evaluation system that is very different from what summative teacher evaluation looks like, what are some guiding questions that will help me? And how can I communicate the results of this? So I sit down as my admin team, we come up with answers to all of these questions, we know what our evaluation system is going to look like. How do I then go back and communicate this to my teachers, to my new administrators who come in? And then something else important is, if I'm a principal in a school, how do I communicate that back to my superintendent? How do I communicate it even further back to, the State Department as well? You're expecting us to get this done. Well, this is what we have. This is what we need. So that was a really interesting idea that came out of the data. The other thing is that the school spent so much time deciding what to do with teacher evaluation data as an admin team, but they never kind of went back to teachers with it and said, hey, because of teacher evaluation, we've recognized that teachers across our school need support with this. And so therefore, in this case, we are bringing in a guided reading coach, and she's going to be supporting you in these ways. Teachers talked about the guided reading coach and how great she was and how thankful they were that she was there, but they never saw the connection back to she was purposefully selected and the teacher evaluation process was helping to do that. All right. So I said that I started in this formative, summative place. Linda Darling-Hammond, wonderful, of course, you guys just saw her. I read her book on teacher evaluation before I started my research. I read it during my research. I read it over and over and over again. And she talks about this every single time I read it, and it didn't hit me. But then when I was going through my data, it hit me in a different way. Although individual teacher evaluation can be a part of an educational improvement strategy, it cannot substitute for ongoing investment in the development and dissemination of profession-wide knowledge through pre-service preparation and work in professional learning communities. Makes complete sense. Yes, teacher evaluation is a piece, but I was still looking at it and thinking summative, formative. it was when I was looking at this data and noticing that some people were getting more out of it, even when it was this really great formative system. And I found 3 unintended consequences of this focus on formative teacher evaluation. First is that it centralized what administrators needed. So if administrators were short on time, administrators decided who gets more time with me, who gets more access to feedback. Obviously, administrators have a lot on their plates. Who gets priority for resources and learning. Administrator dictates the learning perspective, and it became where the administrator kind of owned the learning. So when teachers talked about the teacher evaluation process, it was the administrator who gives their time and resources, the administrator who gives me ideas. It wasn't me actively participating in that process. So Emily, who was a very advanced teacher, who was actually one of the districts, they had master teachers, didn't really get to see her administrator that much, felt like she wants this feedback to learn and grow, but they don't have time for me this year. That was the year that they had some turbulence in their district. So administrators' needs got centralized. The tool itself gets centralized. So no matter how good a tool is, there's a limit to what it measures, right? And when I put all of my professional dialogue around one tool, now I've excluded certainly some aspects of teacher growth from the dialogue. So that's what was happening for teachers. And for teachers that were really high level in their teaching, like Wendy, who wanted to, not only knew that she had to question in a different way, but wanted specific resources and wanted to really push that practice of student questioning, the tool wasn't helpful for her. It was too general, and when her administrator came in, all they could say was, highly effective, you're here on the rubric. She was saying, yes, I know that, but I want to push it further, but that dialogue kind of wasn't supported by that tool. And then the third thing that was interesting is a lot of teachers said, you know what, it's great to sit down with an administrator, but the most helpful part of learning for me is sitting down with my colleagues. So Darling-Hammond said it all along, and then it was like, oh, here it is again. So this is one of the elementary teachers. The most effective feedback for me wasn't actually coming into the classroom, and then went on to describe basically a PLC. But we did this, and I got feedback about that and described all the rounds of a PLC. And I thought, okay, well, I guess what you're saying to me is even though you have that weekly practice, it's different when you get to collaborate with other people and have a professional dialogue. So what I saw essentially is that we kind of know what teacher evaluation must do. Teacher evaluation must kind of decide what practices are effective, force teachers to, at minimum, kind of use effective practices. And I was coming in here where I was saying, okay, but where's the learning? We can kind of use it as a learning process. But it seems like there's so much more that teacher evaluation can and maybe should be, where teacher evaluation, if I'm here in compliance and learning, even if I'm here in learning, it's still a dialogue about administrators, okay? So at this school, principals were saying, we push teachers to da-da-da-da-da-da. I can push the practice. I can drive the practice, right? Which is great. You know, it's better than this where I decided you're not good for this school and you're out, right? I can drive the practice by is very different than I've seen in my own practice as a teacher this and that, and here's what I'm going to do. So what I found was that this summative, formative kind of dialogue that we've all adopted with teacher evaluation still leaves teachers out of the equation. So now looking at what can teacher evaluation be with the reflection, and then culture. You know, how can I use teacher evaluation to influence the culture of my school? In what ways can teachers be using the data collaboratively, which I know Darling-Hammond just talked about, how teachers were doing that in her school, and has talked about for years and years and years, but I was a little slow to the party. All right, so based on that, I revised my theoretical framework looking at it. No longer could I just look at formative and summative, but I could really look at what are collaborative uses, what are cultural uses, how can peers observe each other and give feedback, what kind of supports can administrators give to that. Can teachers use teacher evaluation data collaboratively where they're sitting down and looking at data and making collaborative improvement plans? You know, across our department, this is what we see from our data. Here's what we're going to do. Here's what we need to read. Because when administrators were taking an hour and a half a week to talk to teachers, which is great, teachers now don't have time to talk to each other anymore. So basically, those are the findings of the study. Some really great implications for schools. This idea of meta-evaluation, which Patton writes a lot about as well. But this idea that you can't just implement an evaluation system, you have to take the time to go back and evaluate how you're doing, make changes if you need to. They used K-12 Insight, I think was the name of the survey tool that they used. I haven't looked at what else is out there, but that one did have a lot of information about the evaluation system. Another implication for practice is just to have a professional learning library ready. If you're going to have this formative evaluation system where principals are expected to support teachers with resources, having resources ready to go is really super helpful for principals. So you can say, hey, I notice you need help with routines. Here's an article. Here's a video to look at. Here's this or that. And when the team started dedicating that time, they were able to support teachers a lot better. Principal induction, whether you're talking about at the individual level or really the state level. You know, if we want principals or leaders to formatively evaluate teachers, what skill sets are necessary and what do we need to make sure is in place their first year of leadership. It's very different expectation than what principals have been prepared to do in the past. Framing the work, which we talked about, getting commitment from central office, getting commitment from your teachers, not just at the admin level, but up and down. What does commitment look like to this type of process? And then, of course, linking to that collaborative practice, Policy, thinking about principal licensure or administrative licensure, what can that look like? Again, principal induction. And supporting principal time commitment. If we're going to ask them to dedicate 80% of their day, I know we can't really do that at a state level, but you know, if we're going to ask them to dedicate a lot of time to formative feedback, what are we taking off of their plate, or what are we making easier for them so that they can actually do that work? Possibilities for future research, that's for the geek researcher in me. I know it's not practical for everybody, but I was so interested in these principal study groups. You know, how do principals learn together? How do we professionalize dialogue for principals? Because I think there's been a lot of work around that for teachers, but principals can feel, or administrators can feel like they're all alone in terms of the work that they do. And what tools can we create to kind of support teacher evaluation? We know that we want teachers to use this data, but you know, in order for teachers to use the data, they need a lot of support. Can we create things that make that easier for principals over time? This is okay, I don't want to spend too much time on that. I had a very nice handout for you, but the principal had other ideas for you. I mean, not the principal, the printer had other ideas, so I'm so sorry. I didn't want to bring it with all the lines through it and all of that, but if you would like a handout or anything, you can certainly reach out. Or if you would like to talk about anything or collaborate on anything in the future, I would love to keep contact with all of you. And I'm sorry about the tech issues. So I tried to wrap it up as quickly as possible so we could do comments and questions and kind of talk together. I'm certainly not an expert, but I'm sure you bring a lot of important information to the table as well.
Can you go back to your slide that had culture at the end of it,
Sure.
4 different levels that you had?
Oh, there it is.
You know, I think with that one, when you're looking at it, in that formative assessment, you know, in being in Ohio right now, that's lacking.
Yeah.
You know, our teacher evaluation system is, and sorry for the state board folks.
There is no apology necessary. That's why I'm here.
It's a mess.
Yeah.
And it really doesn't matter what kind of school system you're in across the state. It does not help the teachers. You know, and the administrators are often in a bind. You know, I'm a superintendent, but I was sitting in a principals meeting with my 7 principals on Monday, and the conversation that they're having with their staffs right now is whether you're a value-added teacher or whether in our district we write SLOs for everybody else. Well, the teachers that write SLOs all get 5s because they write their own SLOs.
Right, yeah.
And you would have to be a not very smart teacher if you didn't write an SLO that in the end got you a 5.
Right, right.
So now you're a value-added teacher and you could get a 3.
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know, it's a much different world that they live in. And that piece about having that cooperative collaboration, and we're a big PLC school system, but you've got teachers that are sitting there looking at each other going, you know, this isn't fair.
Yeah.
You know, and it changes our culture.
Right.
You know, it changes our culture within the building.
Right.
And it's a piece that our teachers and our administrators shouldn't have to be even talking about those kinds of things. You know, like you said, they should be able to sit down and whether it is our teacher groups or our teacher and administrator groups, being able to talk about and reflect on the data that they have and how do we get better for kids. Not how is 50% of my evaluation at the end of the year going to be affected by whether I do SLOs or I'm a value-added teacher.
Right.
You know, it's a waste of our time.
Right.
And you know, it'll be interesting later on this afternoon because one of those pieces that I wrote in there is you know, how within a state system of summatives on data that's not good.
Right.
It's not good data. It's
Right.
never been good data. It's not even data that's timely.
Right.
Even if it is good data, it's not timely.
Right, right.
You know, so how can we have those conversations that we need to have on the building, and why does this matter?
Right.
So it's, you know, that local control piece and that ability for us to drive our culture
Right.
and do what we need to do for kids
Right.
is huge.
Right.
And you put a lot of pieces in of being able to use not just summative versus formative, but good data.
Right, right.
However you gather
Right,
that
right,
data.
right, right.
You know, and then have those conversations.
Right. I think you bring up a lot of great points. I mean, Danielson says, hey, you're going to spend all this time collecting the data, you might as well use it, right, in other ways, because it's the same data at the end of the day. But even in New Jersey, we don't have so much weight on the tests. Some teachers do have, it's 25%, something like that.
It varies year to year, but
Yeah.
it usually maxes somewhere between 20 and 30%.
Yeah, which is still can be a lot. But even the idea of wanting to have this formative dialogue or this reflective dialogue, but at the end of the day, I get a 2.67 reported back to the state, even if it's just based on a Danielson rubric and doesn't have the state tests associated with it. There's still a number, there's still a judgment you're going to make about me, and it's really hard to push that dialogue.
You know, and that accountability piece, none of my teachers, or, you know, my community holds me accountable in how our districts work and how our schools work. And we believe in accountability, and we believe, you know, that we need to be able to use, you know, student data, and we have no issues with assessments that are created to bring that data forward. You know, we have a lot of issues with how it's used, and you saw some that Linda was bringing up year to year to year. It's not appropriate necessarily to base too much of a teacher's evaluation on that because their class changes every year.
Right.
Their kids change every year.
There's so many other pieces.
You can't control that.
Yeah.
You know, and I don't want my teachers looking at the children's list of the kids coming up to them and saying, hey, I want these kids.
I don't want this one,
in my class, because I could change my value-added score because of an English teacher. If I have these kids in my class instead of those kids, that's again not conducive to building the culture that you want in your building.
Right. Which is why it's so great that you're here and you're seeking out sessions that, I mean, I hope I added something. I don't profess to really add much, but kudos to you for trying to implement a more formative dialogue around these issues, you know.
State, we are looking at this assessment, and I couldn't agree with you more. What we measure, how we use it is really imperative. We have to. I think Linda summed it up. It's effective teaching is the goal for evaluation, and often prior to that, prior to hearing her say that, I think when evaluations came out, they were more punitive in nature. And so there wasn't this even thought of how is this going to impact the culture, or how is this going to impact, how teachers collaborate with each other. It was purely punitive. I mean, I served on a local board of education for 8 years prior to the state position, and that's what I would hear all the time, is that, this is what we're doing to get rid of bad teachers, that very, very small percentage of a teaching staff that would implement. But this is a whole new mindset that has to be part of the conversation. Education is something that we have to do well. We have to. Children are our future. We say that and it sounds cliche, but there is nothing more true or imperative that we as adults have to get it right.
Well, and the piece, and you brought it up here, is my principles, and I think I'm fairly typical, and I'm actually very blessed because I actually also have academic coaches and I actually have tech coaches that work with the teachers in a very non-threatening manner, and they are collaborative, but they're not part of our evaluation system at all. We're very lucky that our elementary schools all have common planning time for the grade level teachers, and I do academic teaming in the middle schools, and we actually have late starts for our high school teachers to bring them together so that the coaches can work with them. And part of our problem is even though our administrators are they're trusted, because the way the system is they're doing their pre-meeting, they're doing their walkthroughs, they're doing their, depending on whether you're in cycle or out of cycle, 1 evaluation, 2 evaluations, 4 evaluations, and then the post-meeting. And like you said, I don't have that many principals administrators. And most of Ohio is like that. You administratively make yourself very light. So like my 5th and 6th grade building that has 19 teachers, I've got a principal.
Right.
And
he has a lot to do, right? Yeah.
And that's, he might spend 80% of his time doing that.
Right.
But it's a very structured system of doing it. So when he has other meetings, he is really relying on his math coach to work in a very non-threatening, collaborative way to design that culture that, all right, now we're going to use this data in order to actually improve instruction for these particular kids.
Right.
Because we do maps. We've got standardized formative assessments that we've got, and we've worked and we have common tests that we use all the way across the board. So we have lots of data.
Yeah. But then hopefully too that your math coach knows what the expectation of that evaluative culture is, and your teachers know that your math coach can come into your classroom and here's how your math coach can help you. And
and they do. They can model, and it was interesting because you said new teachers going out and visiting, things that we learned, we send one of the coaches with them. So we don't send them all by themselves. They go out and go out to other buildings, and we send one of the coaches with them to sit there and
break it down, right?
And reflect. What did you see? What did you have?
Right.
And that was that aha moment when years ago I sent one of those new teachers out. We're mentoring, we're sending them out, and the teacher comes back and goes, "Oh, it was fantastic. The kids did this, the kids did this, the kids did this." Well, what was the teacher doing? I have no idea what the teacher was doing. But those kids were really doing well. And it's like, oh.
Yeah. Or this is a great project, but you don't know the pieces to get there, right?
So we change around. But it's, and I always appreciate and thank you for being here in these kinds of activities, because it's part of the problem that we deal with at the state level, we feel like is they don't allow us to have a process and take time to do it right. That every 2 or 3 years it changes, and it's, oh, we're supposed to change, but give us time. But you can't have time because we need to fix all this right today. And it's like, oh, but these are kids. That's not how kids work. Right.
Dr. Abdo, I just wanted to, to your point of view, it's very helpful.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you so much.
I just wanted to note that, like, in the culture portion, it seemed a recurring theme to me as your study progressed, the analysis of student work, that it wasn't, a lot of your study focused on the administrators coming and observing stuff, but the teachers were most valuable analysis of student work, and that might be something for the future. There's been a lot of study on it, and I don't know if it's something that we always teach our teachers, so that might be a part of evaluation process, along with how improvement process and things, that data piece of studying student work and do growth could have a place. And also I know the current OSHAS does have a little bit of a differentiated tier in Ohio. You may not be aware where highly effective teachers are able to pick if your school adopts that model, they can pick a professional project. And then that's that, if they're highly effective, then they could do that independent. Our school has not chosen that, which is sad.
Yeah.
Because I think sometimes for those highly effective teachers, again, the rubric may help before, have a differentiated tier evaluation system where if you are highly effective, maybe you go on and pursue national board certification.
Right.
Or maybe if you're at national board certification, an area of interest to you might be Socratic conversations.
Right.
Classroom,
Something
things
else,
like that.
something further.
So if they had a professional project that they could get approved, which I think is a factor, just our school does not do that. So that concept of a differentiated evaluation system might also be.
I think these are all really great points. I love this conversation, but I think I need to turn over the room, right? Thank you so much. I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
I'm going to talk primarily about like the policies that, you know, the process where we
I don't know if people are coming out of lunch or if there's just a lot of sessions, so we might get started. Or all right. So I guess I'll just do a quick introduction here. I'm not going to spend too much time. My name is Dan Quinn, and I'm a doctoral candidate at Oakland University. I'm actually finishing up this semester, hopefully. You know, I got everything done at this point. I'm just waiting on edits to come back. So this is part of kind of my dissertation study, but it is kind of a tangent of it. I'm doing my dissertation work in performance compensation plans that came out of Race to the Top. And in Michigan, it bumps up against teacher evaluation reform. And I've also done some work with teacher satisfaction research, similar to what Dr. Darling-Hammond was talking about earlier in terms of how teacher evaluation systems and conditions that teachers are working in affect satisfaction and affect student performance building off of that. I've got my contact information up here. I have my Oakland email address here. I also have some cards for my professional work if anybody wants one later. And I have 2 Twitters. I go by Teacher Policy on Twitter. So that's the one that I use primarily for my personal work. And then my work Twitter is the Great Lakes Center, which is Great Lakes Cent, CENT on there. And I'm the executive director of the Great Lakes Center. One of the reasons why I chose not to do teacher evaluation reform for my dissertation is that I was a teacher for the last 20 years, and this is the first year that I'm not a teacher. So trying to do teacher evaluation reform from the seat of a teacher was a little too hot. So I actually chose performance compensation reform because I was in a district that didn't have that, and that was part of the conversation that I wanted to look at. So even though they integrate with one another, they are a little bit different. One of the things that I did with the paper that I started with here is I took a little bit back on kind of the origins and kind of the philosophy behind teacher evaluation. So without really thinking that Linda Darling-Hammond was going to be here when I saw this at first, I've got this slide that I've had in my slide deck for about 4 years now. And we talk about the goals here, and it was, I think, her first slide, or very similar to her first slide that she had this morning. And it talks about this conversation about this idea of deep expertise, and we want our students to have this critical thinking, research base, to be able to productively create writing technology and to be able to continually improve our work. We want the same thing for our teachers. So that's kind of like a grounding philosophy as I started with my presentation here, is that's what we're looking to create. So when she talks about building education systems or evaluation systems that work, this is that conversation that we want from our students what we want from our teachers as well. And that kind of leads us into the first point here, and this is Ben Levin going back 1979 or so, and he talks about what I call the key tension that's in the room here, is this idea of creating a system that is designed to help guide decisions about hiring, retention, and it's kind of an accountability system, but at the same time designing one that's going to help improve the actual practice of teaching. And that really becomes a key problem as I listen to different presentations, whether it's on principals trying to deal with the same situation or teachers in the last session looking at how we accomplish this. And it really kind of comes back to this conversation about what do we want? Do we want to fire a bunch of people, or do we want to create a system where people are free to really offer up what they want to do and reflect on practices that are going to be designed for improvement? And this kind of gets into that. And it's been a challenge for both policymakers and practitioners, for building principals and teachers alike, trying to implement these systems. And again, we're building these systems basically while the plane is flying. So we're constructing the plane while the plane is flying, and we're getting a lot of things wrong, and we're getting some things right, and it's hard to distinguish what's going on between the two. As I think about this also in this conversation, this idea of a theoretical orientation for teacher evaluation, John Papay in 2012 wrote a nice policy piece looking at how we should be looking at individual improvement for teacher evaluation systems. Firestone actually talked about kind of his tension here between what he called the psychological perspective and the economic perspective. And that kind of goes to Levin's, key tensions too. This idea that, we want to look at the economic theory of motivation to motivate teachers to perform, but at the same time, we're ignoring in some cases the intrinsic motivation of what brought people to become teachers. And last but not least, Deborah Stipek has actually proposed this idea of using self-determination theory, which is DC and Ryan's core philosophy, of looking at individual accountability, that teachers inherently are, I guess, intrinsically accountable to themselves, and they hold themselves to pretty high standards. And in many cases, if left alone and kind of freed from some of the fears of being fired or having a low evaluation, might actually be more critical and reflect more critically on their own practice by doing that. And it kind of goes to Daniel Pink's work too, when we talk about autonomy, mastery, and purpose, and that individual accountability is part of that conversation. And what I've done from these different perspectives, when I look at the four that I have presented here, I've kind of pulled together what I call kind of like the perfect, evaluation system that I've looked at is this conversation of improvement and accountability. That's that tension. And one of the missing pieces that I like to kind of throw into this is this equitable piece. As we talk about bringing more equity to teachers and supports that they need. So when we put our most inexperienced teachers into the most difficult work environments, how do we create an equitable situation to bring them extra resources and extra supports to be able to be held accountable, and then also to give them the tools necessary to improve? And then when I talk about accountability, I threw on kind of the side one here with Deborah Stipek's concept of individual accountability, that it's not just being held accountable to like an OTES or to Danielson's system, but it's an individual accountability to continually strive to improve your practice is one of those key points that we're looking at. I've got basically two large questions that I'm considering as I move forward with this study here, and this is one of those things that I'm looking at qualitative data. So, in your conversation earlier, you talked about the qualitative piece of principals experiencing this. We want to kind of think about how teacher evaluation policies have changed is the first question. But number two, how much or in what ways have the reform kind of resulted in like positive or negative changes, and what do those forms really kind of take hold of? And then I got the follow-up ones here as we look at those three goals I talked about. In what ways have we moved towards improvement, accountability, and then equity too? And in many cases, when we talk about Michigan, we're really focused on the accountability piece, and it really hasn't resulted in the accountability that people thought. And I think that Ohio's probably similar to that, in that we thought that these changes would, instantly, identify 20% of our teachers as going to be ineffective, and then we're going to fire them. But, we're not seeing that. And some of the best teachers are the ones that are leaving the system because of all of the other factors that are happening. So it's a really interesting question that I think a lot of states are struggling with. And as I said earlier, I was talking about the beginnings of the study, that Michigan is going to be presented as a really decentralized system, whereas Ohio has a single system that has a value-added model that is very defined and has a very strict number. I think it's a 600-point scale I was looking at earlier, and you get a score of X, and you become highly effective, ineffective, whatever it is. Whereas in Michigan, it's much more variable based off of the district that you're in. So where we come from this, where is our current system really evolving from, and where Ohio probably developed from and where Michigan developed from is probably the widget effect. As we think about this conversation that, out of 15,000 teachers, everybody was effective. Everybody was outstanding according to John Merrill when he was reading the report. As we think about kind of the key policies from the widget effect, they basically looked at, every teacher was rated as good. It was a satisfactory, unsatisfactory system. They lacked specific feedback and improvement. They neglected, the development of novice teachers and how we can give them the tools to be able to improve upon their practice. And last but not least, this conversation about how difficult it was to fire a teacher or to get rid of a poor performer. And Dr. Darling-Hammond this morning addressed this last one, that when you kind of build the system correctly, this last piece is a necessary one, that there needs to be a mechanism there, but it's a mechanism of last resort. If you identify somebody who's struggling, what supports have you provided for that teacher is really the key question. And if they've been provided with additional supports and they aren't performing, at where they should be, that's where that last piece of poor performance should kick in. Things to consider, and this is kind of the outline of Michigan versus Ohio here. Ohio was one of the states that had some of these pieces in place. Michigan was one of 14 states that did not have any type of a requirement for a certain number of evaluations. Teachers could go 2, 3 more years. Practice in most of the districts in the Detroit area was once every 3 years. So you'd be, observed and reviewed, every year for your first 4 years, and once you became tenured, it was every 3 years after that. And in some districts, it was up to 5. I think is one of the things that I had seen in some of the contracts that were bargained. Michigan at the time really only had kind of a strict regulation for probationary teachers. Tenured teachers was left up to the discretion of the local school board. And then again, when we look at this one, Michigan was one of the states that did not have annual evaluation. So 21 states at the time prior to 2009 had annual evaluations required, and Michigan did not. So tenured teachers were generally observed, once in a 3-year period, and it was usually kind of a qualitative report, and it basically had like 3 sections. What was going on in the classroom, how are you assessing your instruction, and then there was a reflection piece that was offered as kind of a third tier to that one. Since that time, Race to the Top occurs. $4.35 billion was allocated to states, and Michigan went through the hoops process of becoming a Race to the Top state, and they didn't get it. Ohio is an example of a state that gets the money, and Michigan is one of the examples of what happens when you make all of these policy changes and you have no money to implement these changes. So as we think about some of the things that happened here, is not only did we adopt the Common Core standards in Michigan to a certain degree, they're called Michigan standards now, and we've gone through a couple different revisions. We've also created a data system, and that's actually probably the most, robust of all of these things that have happened here, is that the data system is in place and is publicly accessible and has really created a nice opportunity for research to be done on schools. Using the statewide data system that was put in place. And then number 3 is where I'm doing my dissertation work, and we're talking about this idea of trying to create a compensation system that recruits, develops, and rewards teachers for excellent teaching. And then coupled with that was the evaluation piece that we're talking about today. And then last but not least was the turnaround project. And somebody was mentioning earlier, some examples of things that we implemented is a statewide turnaround district, the Education Achievement Authority, which was implemented in Detroit and then just disbanded this summer, because it was something that was not given any extra funding to be able to operate, and the schools turned out were actually performing lower than the public schools that they had taken them away from in many cases. So as we talk about kind of the race to the top and the dollars here, I went into the U.S. Department of Education's map here, and you can see that Ohio gets $400 million in phase 2 to be able to implement their system. Michigan gets 0. These changes that were implemented with Race to the Top were baked in 2012 with the No Child Left Behind waiver process. So Michigan passed the Race to the Top legislation and then bakes it into the Michigan Department of Education's framework in 2012 to be able to make these changes. As I kind of dig into this a little bit, the policy that gets passed in 2009 rolling into 2010, just before the deadline for round 1, they basically had a midnight session at the state legislature to pass. I think it was one bill that they ended up passing, but it had like 17 different components to it to be able to be eligible for Race to the Top. And again, this change here is an annual performance. And one of the things that Michigan did initially in 2009, 2010, is that they didn't define a set number. And this is part of the reason why Michigan doesn't get a Race to the Top grant, is that like Ohio said, we're going to do 50%, which was the threshold that the federal government was recommending. Michigan at the time said we're going to have a significant amount. And it depended on the local district. Most districts interpreted that to be about 25%. And that was kind of the initial kind of the push out of this. Before the 2009-2010 reforms happened, we passed what I call the Students First bills. And Students First, which is Michelle Rhee's reform organization, comes into Michigan and pumps a lot of money into the state legislature to change some things. And one of the things that they did is that they made teacher evaluation a prohibited subject of bargaining. I guess it would be similar to Senate Bill 5 in Ohio was one of the things that happened where they were talking about collective bargaining. Michigan didn't necessarily get rid of collective bargaining, but they got rid of the right to bargain over a teacher evaluation system. So it's a really interesting perspective here. And Michigan then in 2011 mandates that, I guess it was going to be by 2016-17, that 50% of a evaluation was going to be based off of student data. Student growth is what they were looking at. And they left growth undefined. So the state at the time was investigating student growth models and a value-added system with that. One of the things that happens in 2011 is that they actually pass an executive order. The governor passes an executive order to put together a statewide commission to study teacher evaluation and how to do it best in Michigan. And Deborah Ball at the University of Michigan is the chair of this commission, and it has some political components to it. So each member of the leader of both houses in Michigan got to recommend leaders to be on the commission. They spend almost 2.5, almost 3 years studying teacher evaluation, and they put together in the summer of 2003 what's called the Building and Improvement Focused System for Educator Evaluation in Michigan, which is a comprehensive system, and it mirrors a lot of what OTES is my interpretation of it. It included a recommendation for a statewide value-added system. It implemented some pilot districts and studied what was happening at the district level. And they allowed for some flexibility, but the goal was to eventually go to one statewide system in Michigan. That really doesn't happen. So in 2014, so actually beyond that, one of the things that they also recommended is that in 2009-10, we moved from basically like a two-tier or a three-tiered system where you would have either satisfactory or unsatisfactory to a four-tiered system. And the idea was that now we have what's called ineffective, minimally effective, effective, and highly effective. She actually recommended in her presentation to the state school board that we should have an ineffective teacher, a provisional teacher, and then a professional, and that it would be a tiered system, much like what Ohio has in terms of this conversation about developing, and then eventually you get to the advanced system here. And then they also wanted to move from, when we move from a provisional certificate to a professional certificate, which is the second certificate in our system, that you would have to have had 3 years of professional ratings, the highest rating, to be able to move into that. And one of the things that was the reason is they wanted to get rid of this highly effective category in our teacher evaluation system. There's a lot of hang-up between people who are effective and highly effective in Michigan. And the idea was that once you get into the top tier, it's going to be a broad pace where most of your teachers would be in the professional section, but it would get rid of that, I guess the problem that a lot of teachers have with the fairness issue of whether somebody was highly effective or not highly effective. They recommended a continuation of 4 models, and this is what is really in place today. We still have 4 models that are the dominant models in Michigan. And we use Marzano, Danielson, the Thoughtful Classroom, and 5 Dimensions are the 4 that are in Michigan. And for the most part, it initially was Danielson and Marzano were the dominant ones, but there's been a real big push with the 5 Dimensions. Our State Principals Association is a trainer for the 5 Dimensions, so a lot of our secondary schools are really pushing towards the 5 Dimensions because the data really connects with the way the evaluation system is put in place. So this is really kind of where we are in 2013. A lot of this gets proposed in a series of bills, so I'm kind of walking through the legislative process here. In 2014, the bills get put forward, but they don't get passed. So we go through a policy change in 2009, a policy change in 2011, and then a policy change in 2014 potentially, and it eventually stalls for a variety of reasons, specifically dealing with this 50%. There were some people in the legislature that wanted to maintain this 50%, and there was a big push from a lot of the education groups, from the universities, from the teacher associations, to try and move from 50%. And eventually they do move from it, and you'll see that. One of the things that I like to do is I like to show this picture here, and this is the bill signing when they finally proposed new changes in 2015. They get it across the finish line, and they do improve upon the changes that were made in 2010 and 11. But one of the things I like to kind of highlight as I do this is I go back to kind of the picture here that when the 2011 bill is signed, that there's a student's first flag in the background, and there's a small handful of people that are there. In 2015, they include more stakeholders. So there are representatives from higher education in the picture. There are representatives from the Principals Association. Teacher union lobbyists are in the picture. There are state legislators that are part of this. It was a much more robust conversation, and the state really took a much more thoughtful look at teacher evaluation reform in 2015. And we're still now implementing the 2015. So we're in 2017. So we're now in the second year of these reforms really getting, underway in Michigan. So as we think about what this does, the 2015 reforms put a pause on the 50% clause in terms of student data being used for teacher evaluation. It will eventually grow to 40% next year. But right now it's capped at 25%. So some of the schools that went to 50% almost immediately, they've actually had to roll it back. Some of the schools that were hesitant have had to ramp it up a little bit during this time period. Because a couple of the contracts that were negotiated in 2009-10 still use the language significant, because that was the law of the land when they negotiated the contract at that time. One of the things that it did do is it provided some rules regarding administrator evaluations, which was missing in some of the earlier race to the top discussions here. Even though it mentioned administrators weren't necessarily held to the same standards as the teachers, and now the administrators have some evaluation rubrics that they're focused on. And they have two, I believe. It's the Advanced Administrator Evaluation Instrument, and then the Reeves Leadership Model. It's a rubric that they're using. The state also set aside, for the first time, $14.8 million. So just to put it into perspective, Ohio received the $400 million to implement the teacher evaluation reform. Michigan dedicated $14.8 million. So there's still a lot of, funding inequities that's happening, and a lot of things that are being proposed for school districts are unfunded mandates in many ways as we think about this one. The House fiscal analysis of the bill actually recommended that it was going to take anywhere from $16 to $42 million to fully implement. But they only set aside 14.8. So, just enough to kind of meet that bottom threshold, but nowhere near what they thought was going to take school districts. So school districts implementing this, the ones that are better funded are probably further ahead. The ones that are less funded are a little bit further behind because they haven't been able to receive the professional development training that some of the others have. Again, as I do this, I'm going backwards, aren't I? So again, I have in here, this is all the legislation and where it occurs in the school code, so I'm going to skip over this one here. But this is kind of what we've settled on in Michigan. So Ohio's got a much more robust system. In the last presentation I saw, the 50%, and then they had different tiers for the 50%. So you're either in like tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, tier 4. This is for everybody. So right now we have 60% as of 2018-19 will be the district evaluation tool, which will be taken from one of the 4 models that I described earlier. 20% will be measured by student growth on state assessments. but Michigan has revised their student assessment, so they will just have 3 years worth of data as we roll into 2018-19. So they won't necessarily have good data, and there's no value added score to go with it. So the student data is still going to be up to the local school district to determine how they're going to measure that 20%. Whereas, in Ohio, you get a number from the state, and then that's applied to the teacher. That's not there yet in Michigan. In terms of the student growth, that's going to be kind of that bucket that Linda Darling-Hammond was talking about earlier, that it could be student learning objectives, it could be a portfolio, it could be a pre-test, post-test. Right now in Michigan, the 25% that is being applied to the teachers is up to the local school district to determine that. So some school districts in Michigan are using student learning objectives. Some are using NWEA scores. Some are using, and then even within school districts, you might have high school teachers using AP practice tests. And then at the elementary level, you might be using a pre-test, post-test. So even within the district, whether you're an elementary teacher or a high school teacher, you're going to have a different evaluation experience. And then between districts, you're going to have a huge variability with that. On top of that, the way it's been interpreted, some school districts have decided to, set quotas on the number of highly effective teachers. Some are more free with it. And then some of them have decided not to rate anybody as highly effective. Is kind of an interesting way that they went about it. One of the nice things about Michigan that has come out of this is, from a research perspective, is that the school district is now responsible for reporting out. So the district does report out school-wide and district-wide averages for the different categories. So every school and every school district, now you can figure out how many teachers were rated as highly effective, effective, minimally effective, or ineffective. And that goes on to every single district website. So, every one of the 600 districts in Michigan, 500 and some odd districts in Michigan, have a little picture that looks like this in the corner of their website. You click on it and you can find their student data or I'll rephrase that, their evaluation data. That's tied into it. The other thing, too, that they've had to figure out is that there were a lot of districts that were using their own evaluation system that were hybrids of Danielson and Marzano and other things. It has really forced them to go back and rethink what evidence looks like. So they have to provide on their website research to the Danielson model. So they actually have to prove to their constituents in the community, research that, proves the validity of the Danielson model or the Marzano model or the 5D model. And then the districts, are responsible for posting that on their own website. So not only do they have to tell their communities what tools they're using, they have to report on what percentage of their teachers are highly effective or effective. And then I believe in the law still that if they have a teacher that is ineffective or minimally effective, the school has to send a letter home to the parents stating that they have a minimally effective or an ineffective teacher that year. And they have the ability of some intra-district school choice as a result of that one. One of the things that I found as I've started to dig into the data, and this is about a year old, the 2015-16 data just came out this summer, so it's lagging a little bit in terms of the reporting to the state. But I have 2011 through 2015 data here, and one of the things that you're finding here is that the widget effect is still in effect. Using that as kind of a short term here, about 99% of our teachers, are still getting, either effective or highly effective. One of the interesting things is that the percentage of effective teachers has kind of dipped, and the percentage of highly effective teachers has started to increase, and that's where a follow-up study would take place, looking at, why is that happening, and some of the distinctions that were happening with that. Same kind of the opposite graph. So this is looking at percentages. The next graph is raw numbers. So it's presenting kind of the opposite. So you're looking at out of 97,000 teachers in Michigan, almost 100,000 teachers, that you're dealing with less than 3,000, less than 2,500 in 2014-15 that were either minimally effective or ineffective. And your ineffective number, you're into the low 463 teachers total in the state of Michigan out of almost 100,000 teachers were rated as ineffective. So it's a really small number when we dig into the data. And I presented that as a raw number because I think it stands out, more so than a percent of 1%. I think only 400 out of 100,000, just to put it into that distinction. Again, we see some variation. So here, almost 95,000 for 2014-15 were reported. There's a higher number of actual teachers, but depending on how the districts report out, you can see what's happening at the state level. Here's what's happening in a district like Farmington, which is just outside Detroit. This is just an extreme example of a district where they just rated everybody as effective. I've actually had some conversations with teachers and administrators in Farmington, and this is not scientific or robust here. It's anecdotal. But one of the things that they did is they decided that they wanted to take the heat off the evaluation system in the early years of the evaluation and really focus on the individual domain. So they're a Marzano district. So what they're using is the domain individual ratings to think about where they're doing their staffing in Michigan or in Farmington here. So it's a really interesting thing. So they basically said, don't worry about whether you're going to be ineffective or not, but we're still going to staff based off of the nuances that are happening in the 4 domains. And it's created some controversy and some other things, but it just gives you kind of an example of where we are. Again, as we think about this one, Ed Trust Midwest, which is kind of a center-left, group in Michigan, they actually did their own study a couple years ago. 2012-13 is when they were looking at this one, and they found basically that nothing was being implemented in the early years. So when the reforms happened in 2009-10, very little change happened by 2012. The state did some testing too, as they talked about things that were included in it. As they did a survey of all of the different evaluation systems that were available, these were the things that they were finding in their, the cross-section here. Instructional practices dominated, but one of the things that started to creep in, and is kind of an important one, is the last one on here, is this absenteeism from the job affecting performance and holding teachers accountable in the evaluation system for their absences. So that's something that I thought was an interesting picture. Again, this is from the state as we talk about this one. This is using for high school teachers, so that was elementary school teachers. And now this one here is talking about what are they using. And one of the things that's interesting is that this was from 2012-13. In 2015, we narrowed it down to 4. So it was the second highest one here, which is internally developed tool. The school districts in Michigan no longer have the ability to have their own tools because they're all defaulting to the 4 primary ones, which are Danielson, Marzano, the 5 dimensions, and then the thoughtful classroom. And again, most of them are using Marzano or Danielson as their rubric that they're using for teacher evaluation. Again, this one should have been up a couple slides earlier, but this was a study that was done as part of Deborah Ball's group. The researchers at U of M used data from 14 districts and looked at the same trends that I was looking at earlier. Back in 2012-13, I believe, is the data that they were using. And you can see that there's a variation. Like a district like District A is very similar to the Farmington district that I presented earlier, where almost 100% were effective. You can see that the green is the largest across most of these, except for District K, which is almost all highly effective. So they went the other route where they just determined that everybody was highly effective except for a select few that were effective. And you can see that there's very few districts that are identifying teachers as really needing improvement. Again, this kind of takes us forward to this year. Just this summer, Martin Kraft and Alan Gilmore put together a revision of the widget effect. So the original widget effect looked at 12 districts across 4 states. Their new model basically found some of the same things, but one of the things that was really interesting about this one, and it's very applicable to your study, is the principal role here. And they were finding, as we take a look at principals, that principals kind of on paper, off to the side, were identifying more teachers for improvement. But when it came down to pushing that final button for the evaluation, they were going up and rating them a little bit higher, in part because of the 4 things that came up here. And it's very similar to what we talked about earlier, time constraints, this idea of giving new teachers a little bit more leeway, that they were hesitant to give somebody an ineffective rating because they wanted to see them grow maybe into the next year, and they didn't want to necessarily fire them. As we also take a look at this one, the last one here, I guess second last one, the personal discomfort. Telling somebody that they need improvement is not an easy conversation. So, I don't think that was as predominant as when I was looking at this. I was just pulling the numbers out. Another one that I thought was really interesting, and I saw it in your paper when I dig into this one, Doug Harris and Kyle Ingold pulled this one together, and this was an interesting one. They did a qualitative study and a quantitative study of this, and one of the things that I thought was a really interesting piece as we talk about this conversation about how to design an evaluation system here is this piece about high value-added teachers that were getting low principal ratings. And it was a really kind of an interesting one. And some of the responses, they kind of pulled them together, is that teachers who were getting really high value-added scores were really not necessarily the most, the best team players. And they were what they called lone wolves because they were focusing on improving their scores, and they were kind of hoarding their knowledge a little bit. Whereas the teachers that were getting higher scores on some of the principal evaluations might not have been receiving the highest value-added scores. So as we think about designing it, we have to think about this, not only the dual purpose of designing improvement, designing a system for improvement and accountability, but also as we think about this one, are we trying to raise test scores or are we trying to improve teaching, and how do principal decisions fit into that? And that's a key thing as we have to think about in terms of like leadership application. What are the questions and considerations that we have for that? A couple things building off of principal leadership here. This is a study that came out of the U.S. Department of Education. Teachers were 2.5 times more likely to say that they were satisfied with their evaluation if they viewed their principal as a strong instructional leader. So this role of a principal in the process is an important piece. Another one that I thought was interesting here, and this one I always say is the duh one. Teachers that had the highest ratings of teacher evaluation also were the most satisfied with the process. So if you were rated as highly effective, you were more likely to view the process as being a satisfied process or a satisfying process. So I just thought that was kind of a simplistic one, but it points out to how we interpret this. Teachers' response to evaluation is going to matter. Who their evaluator is, and then on top of that, where are they on the spectrum? Are they getting an effective rating and being told they need to improve upon it, or are they getting rated highly effective and they don't feel any value in getting highly effective? So that's something that I thought was an important piece. I work through the Michigan Education Association and the Ohio Education Association and the Illinois Education Association. My organization works with teacher unions, and one of the ones that came out of the Michigan Education Association and AFT was a survey last year. It was not scientific, and they didn't do any reporting, so it's basically descriptive. But it's really an interesting one as we talk about how teachers are responding to it. It was a sample of 11,000, so it was a very large sample. But one of the things that I thought was really interesting is that, of the responses, only 7% of the respondents to this large survey said that the teacher evaluation system was having an impact on their teaching. So, if we're making all of these investments to change our teaching practices, it's apparently not having a large effect. And then 60% said that the changes actually had a negative impact on their teaching. And I don't necessarily agree with that large of a one, but it was kind of an interesting component. One of the reporters that was discussing the study actually dug into some of the responses that were publicized, and they talked about it being based off of the Hunger Games, that evaluation systems have become kind of this, survival of the fittest program, and not really designing a collaborative system. So yeah, I'm putting forth these survey results just as kind of like an extra point to think about. They really aren't valid or reliable, but it's something that kind of gives us some discussion for future designs. One of the things I found a little bit, I guess uplifting about this is that Michigan loves reports. So the Michigan Council on Educator Effectiveness had a report. There's a group that was put forward by the governor that came out and is talking about teachers and teacher improvement as one of their primary goals. And then the Michigan Department of Education, as part of their strategic plan, they're calling it becoming a top 10 state in 10 years is the goal here. And goal 3 specifically mentions this implementation of our educator evaluator law and getting more implementation is really what the big push here is. But again, we see in both of these, teachers' improvement is really what we want to focus on. And the question is, do we want to really build a system that's going to be designed for improvement, or do we want to design one that's going to catch more teachers, and fire all the bad teachers of sorts? And I don't know if Ohio's going through the same thing as Michigan, but the teacher preparation programs are hurting for teachers in Michigan. I think since 2008, the teacher preparation numbers have dropped almost 50% in Michigan. So that's an interesting piece, but not necessarily, it's correlated, but not necessarily causational as we think about this. So I go back to those 3 questions and kind of open it up for discussion here. I covered a lot. Any questions? Yeah.
One question I have about midway through, you talked about the recommended changes by MCEE.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the recommendation was for categories professional, provisional, and effective.
Yes.
So, and I didn't hear you reference those anymore after that, so it was not adopted.
No, so we still have 4 rating systems, just like Ohio. We just call them different things. It's ineffective, minimally effective, effective, and highly effective.
Are there any consequences from one year to the other? Because on those recommendations, there was a lot of carryover. A certain rating one year could follow you for a few years.
Yeah.
Is there any sort of carryover?
Not with the provisional and the professional certificates, but Michigan adopted a 3rd-tier licensure system. Ohio has one, I believe, as well. And the 3rd-tier licensure system is the advanced professional certificate, and I think they have to have 3 years of highly effective or effective. I think it's worded as either or to be rated as a advanced professional certificate. And they also have to meet other qualifications like a national board certified program, or there's 4 colleges in Michigan that have teacher leadership programs, and they have to graduate or attend one of those programs.
So I'm going to ask you to say part of that again.
Yeah.
You said 3 years of highly effective.
Yeah. I think that's the goal, is to have 3 years of highly effective to be able to move to that top tier. The only thing that is interesting is that it just started to roll in, but the problem is there's no compensation for it, so no teachers have actually kind of gone to that level yet. So I believe so. I have to look at it in a little bit more detail. But the 3 years stands out right now based off of what I've done in my reading.
Great presentation. Thank you very much. I think a lot of it comes back to Levine from the 3rd slide, those dual purposes in terms of promoting improvement versus, employment decisions.
Yeah.
And then Michigan, it's interesting, the title that they have of that plan, building an improvement-focused system. How would you evaluate that? Do you think that's true? Do you think this really is a program about an improvement system, or has it degenerated to who's good and who's bad and who do we get rid of?
Yes. As I think about that question, the goal, I think, in all of the language, so if you read the wording from the Michigan Department of Education, or if you attend a workshop, an administrator training workshop or a teacher evaluation, that the language is all about the language of improvement. And since 2015, that is a definite change. In terms of what's happening in practice, that's something that's going to be more variable based off of the district and to the building. I offhand, anecdotally, I've seen it happen kind of in the good, the bad, and the ugly, where I see teachers are going through the evaluation process, and they're really taking this focus on the growth aspect of it, and how do I grow as a professional, and the language is really there. But at other times, it feels like to some teachers that it's being held over them. And at the end of the day, they don't necessarily agree that it's changing what they actually do. But I think it was the second presentation I went to earlier was talking about teacher perceptions in Ohio. It was one of the students from Findlay was looking at that kind of that hoops, and I think there's a lot of people that want to be able to push it towards that growth model, but they're not necessarily there yet. And right now, it feels to a lot of people that it's like a hoop-driven system. And it really, and at the end of the day, the question that a lot of teachers will report back, is, it's really not changing anything. We're still getting 98%, almost 100% of teachers highly effective or effective. Is it worth all of this time that these principals are putting into these evaluations? And they're spending hundreds of thousands of hours, it feels like, throughout the years, trying to get a number on a teacher, and it really isn't changing things.
For trends, do you see that the large districts are ahead of the game, or is it the small farming communities that are working at this more diligently?
I'd have to look at that a little bit more closely, but one of the things that is interesting is that some of the districts that might not have the resources, it's an easy thing to just pick one of the 4 models to them, and they just pick one without necessarily doing the study. I think some of the larger districts are doing a more robust study of which one fits with their district's needs. In my own study, I'm doing a study on performance compensation, and in one of the interviews with one of the 3 districts I'm studying, they actually chose to use 2 different evaluation systems for their 2 buildings. It's a very small district, and they have I think they're using Danielson for their special ed building, and they're using the 5D for their CTE program. So it's kind of an interesting thing. The CTE teachers wanted more robust data, and they felt that the 5D talks about data in the domains a little bit more than Danielson does. Because Danielson doesn't really address the data conversations. And a lot of things, what's happening is, you get a score, let's say, Danielson, Marzano, whatever it is, and then you have this data conversation, and they're happening separately. So teachers have to have a discussion every year about their data, but their data doesn't necessarily match up with what their instructional goals are. So they might have a student data target where they want to say, I want 50% of my kids to pass the AP exam. But on their instructional goal might be to have more engagement. But the 2 aren't necessarily, informing the other.
It seems to me that there's really no validity between districts or even schools as to what these ratings mean. So from a data perspective, if someone is highly effective here and someone's highly effective there, that doesn't mean anything really.
Yeah.
But we all know this is not merely a data issue. There's a political side to this. So I wonder how this plays out in the public. How is the public aware of these ratings? How does that?
Well, they're reported in the paper, and a lot of times they report, the fact that 98%. So, it's critical of the fact that more teachers aren't being rated ineffective is the media take on this. From a district to district perspective, I can only speak with some of the studies that I've worked on, and in my performance compensation one, it actually came up in conversation with the 2 teachers that were in my study that the district next door was rating more teachers as highly effective because it gets reported in the paper that they have a higher percentage of highly effective teachers. So in a competition system, they were saying, well, it was unfairly, labeling their district as being less effective because they had fewer effective teachers. So it does create that. And does that mean that District A is more effective than District B? We don't know. And I think that's the problem of a decentralized system like Michigan, is that not only do you have, within district variation, but now you have between district variation happening as well. Whereas at least in Ohio, with a single system, there's no variation between districts, I guess. Yeah, I guess in terms of the implementation, there will be to a certain extent. Yeah, reliability issues on all of these. So.
But I see like a place like Farmington,
yeah,
it benefits districts to say, hey, look, all our teachers are, effective or highly effective, but then that, of course, defeats the purpose of really either one of those two things. But that's the political realm that, is out there.
I actually work for the Marzano model. I work in Michigan very heavily there
yes.
all the time. I work in Ohio, I work in New Jersey, and I have worked for the company Learning Sciences for 10 years, and so I've been through from the very beginning of racism.
Yeah.
And in each state prior to this process. So exactly what you're describing, we've observed heavily. We will never change that until we take away the reporting of teacher evaluation to the public. As long as the public can see it, and with or without an understanding of what the rating means, it really doesn't matter, because some do get it very clearly, some majority do not, but that's up for parents and community. We'll never change it. So the opportunity within all of this is the conversation. And the more we can prepare school leaders to give meaningful feedback that impacts instruction, and we get to that granular level, that's the opportunity, right? That's the opportunity. So pick a model, embrace a model that helps your school leaders get to that point.
And I think Michigan is there with 4 models is the problem. If they just and right now it's we're starting to see the I guess the fidelity of implementation actually occurring. It's taken from 2009 to 2017 to get to that level, and we're starting to see that. One of the things that is interesting too is because seniority rights were taken away in 2011. That was part of the slide process too. That it actually the evaluations are what's being used for seniority purposes. So one of the things that's interesting is not only do you have like district to district, like competition like that, but you might have a principal that wants to shield a younger teacher from being laid off by labeling them as highly effective. And a more senior teacher is labeled as effective. So they're not necessarily labeled as ineffective, but they can keep the younger teacher without having to play the game, I guess, or they are playing the game, I guess, is the other way of saying it. So even if they're getting good feedback under a rubric, like the Marzano system, you still have this gaming of the system that's occurring.
And it will always happen that way. And it doesn't matter the model. This has nothing to do with the model that you choose.
And then I did a study on performance compensation. In the 3 districts that I studied in terms of performance compensation, they chose teacher evaluation ratings as their performance compensation. So not only was it something that is determining their seniority, but now it potentially could cost them $100, $1,000, or $5,000 in the high-end district. So.
I applaud Michigan for a lot of the policies that you've put forth. I think have pushed on some of these systems a little bit.
And that's part of the presentation earlier was the policy churn, that we started with, this initial policy in 2009, and it has continually evolved. And I think, with a couple more policy tweaks, I think we could get to a system that's a little bit more robust. So that's it.
Thank you.
Thanks. So if you've been Farmington that I had on the slide is a Marzano district. So.
Feedback on there from them? I would be so curious.
No, because what I was doing is I was using them as an example of a district that put everybody as effective.
Oh yes, that's very true. Very true.
schools in Michigan, and that most of your teachers are trained in Michigan.
Yes.
Great university.
Of Teachers of the Year and asking them about things like feedback was that some of them get feedback really late, well after their evaluation. They no longer remember the lesson. The principal doesn't remember the lesson. And so the feedback is not at that point actionable, but immediate feedback, or as close to immediate as one can get, allows the teacher then to say, okay, I remember, I still have the materials out, I still have the lesson plan right here. I can look at that and see what is something that I need to do that will help me to do better next year. But, you know, if you wait a month, then that may not happen, or don't do it at all.
And just to add to that, even a week lapse of time passing, that's too long also. I mean, really, I think the closer we get to the actual observation or immediately following the observation, even if it's preliminary feedback, doesn't have to be the final evaluation, feedback. I think there's great value in starting the conversation that way. One of the things that the Marzano model has done recently is we just in 2017, we made a pretty dramatic modification to our evaluation instrument. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at it yet, but with this whole topic in mind is how do we support to a very granular level the instructional processes. And Marzano has always kind of been known for that with the strategies, but we've taken it a step further in the level of student evidence, and different than teacher evidence, but the level of student evidence and the discussion about the standard and taxonomy and all of those things. So giving the principal a voice. To your point, it's difficult to expect a principal to be an instructional leader to the level that we need them to be. They need to be a peer teacher of equal or higher standard to give the meaningful feedback, and so it's difficult to have that kind of an environment, but
Thank you. Next question. What can local districts do to improve teacher evaluation processes, regardless of the state policy? What can local school districts do to improve teacher evaluation processes, regardless of what the state policies may or may not be?
I'll start on that one if you don't mind. We just got out of a session where we heard an administrator talking about what their district does to support their teachers, and I think that's they decided on some common assessments, they decided on some common goals, and they worked together to put it together. They shared it with the teachers, gave some training on how to use it, and they supported their teachers in using these common goals and common assessments. So working within the framework that you have, but working to support your teachers and give them what they need in order to do their job, that really is where you begin.
Wherever possible, be authentic and genuine and not just compliant.
Yeah, it was so refreshing to hear that gentleman speak, because he was talking about a culture in his particular building that he probably had worked very hard to create, that was so supportive of teachers. And on the rare occasion that I will hear it, I've traveled around the country, and some principals will say something like, well, you know, I don't give a level 4, or oh, with my beginning teachers, I don't give them anything higher than a level 2. And there are all these gotcha, you know, you talk about what can local districts do. Well, I could tell them something to do with someone who would say that kind of a thing. But what local districts can do is work, you know, together as a team, like you said, to create a culture that's supportive of teacher improvement, and not a culture of inspection or those gotcha kind of things that present company accepted.
Well, and let's include principals in that as well. Not only because Ohio has the principal evaluation, but because that's important, that there's two entirely large chunks of who's in the classroom and who's in the school there, that if they are in tune, that can significantly shift the culture as well. I know they're like, aren't you the union person? Like, yeah, I know. Crazy.
One thing I'd like to add is, I guess you'd say it's the gift of time. And I recall my first year teaching, and I was a terrible teacher, as many first year teachers are. And I was teaching special ed, and I couldn't get the kids to sit down. They were throwing things, they were calling me names. It was pretty dreadful. And I shared the kids with another special ed teacher who's very experienced. And I taught 2 subjects, and she taught the other 2. So I said, I can't get the kids to do anything. I can't teach these kids. And she said, well, I don't have any problem with those kids. And so the principal got someone to cover my class and let me go and observe her teaching my worst kids. And they were wonderful. They were learning, they were behaving, there were no problems, they were actually getting it done. And that was the big lesson for me was, oh my God, it's not the kids, it's me. I've got to do something here. But that one time that I was allowed to leave my class, somebody else took it, so that I could go and observe some good teaching was so powerful.
One of the observations that we have is that culture of trust. This is really what we're talking about, is a culture of trust, where it's trusting from the top down and from the bottom up. So, and it goes both ways. And it does start, I think, at central office, because when central office is supportive of school leadership, they have their back, they have transparency, there's support, you know, that culture trickles down. That culture is then conveyed. And I think that, to your point about peer collaboration and being able to visit classrooms and having that blessing of time, that is such a huge piece. And that is a giant shift culturally in many schools, being able to open doors, and by volunteers, certainly not to be done to a teacher, but creating that culture and asking for volunteers at the beginning of the school year, something as simple as that has such a huge impact on changing that process. But
good, thank you. You just touched on collaboration, but this next question is also about collaboration, and I think this also ties in very nicely to the keynote address this morning. But it's evident how important collaboration and collegiality is into the process. But how can we incorporate collaboration and collegiality into teacher evaluation? How can we fold that in if you're building a system?
can include it in the evaluation system and the evaluation instrument. Yes. Recognition for it as an important aspect of teacher professional development. Recognize it in terms of creating procedures and an opportunity for those types of collaborative processes to happen. And if the evaluation system is the only instrument, if that becomes the instrument to facilitate the beginning of that process, then utilize that. And the other side of that might be make it completely non-evaluative. So you have teacher collaboration where it is not a part of evaluation in any way. I know some of the evaluation instruments have collaboration as an aspect, so you're giving credit to and recognizing, and there's value in that, so you're identifying the level of importance. But again, coming back to trust in a safe place, with just the opportunity to have a very common granular focus. You were talking about just individual students within the classroom that the teacher could go see. Having that very granular focus, I think, and peer collaboration goes a long way.
We talk about making the evaluation process collaborative in that when the observer goes into the classroom to collect evidence, and then that evidence is sorted into different categories or components depending on what instrument you use. And then those notes, then that data are given to the teacher to look at. And saying, I was in your classroom, this is what I saw. And then the first question is, did I miss anything? Or would you change any of the evidence? Because before we even start looking at this and interpreting this, I want to make sure that you and I agree that that's what went on. And so oftentimes the teacher will add some things because they were there, and so they can add some things to that evidence. And then the next thing I would say to the teacher is, I would like you to pencil in the score. This is teacher reflection. It's 4A in our work. And would you just pencil in the scores that you would give yourself? Because the rubric as well, if not better than I do. And so then the teacher does that and hands it to the principal, and the principal's been penciling it in. And nothing is finalized then until there's a conversation. And when you see that the teacher rates herself or himself very much like you would, that conversation is entirely different than if those scores are disparate. But in the best case scenario, it's, oh my goodness, we agree. Where would you like to start the conversation? And that I need to be willing to say, oh my goodness, I had rated you this, but having had this conversation, I'm going to change my score. And you talk about trust and how to build trust. And so now the teacher's leaving, oh my goodness. It was, I felt, it was the first time I've had a professional conversation with my observer. That kind of collaboration, that it isn't just me sitting here and here are your scores. Would you sign here and put these on my secretary's desk? In blood, yeah.
Well, and so while you're talking, and I like the message, and I'm thinking of the contracts we've been part of negotiating where the issue is all had to, 3 pages on when evidence can be provided. When is the cutoff? How much will the evaluator value the evidence? If it's late, is that a less important piece of evidence? And all of that is reactive to the trust issue and the good conversation.
I'm thinking also, you mentioned collaboration being part of the instrument, which in Ohio, it's in the rubric. And then there's the collaboration with the evaluator. But then I also think the next step is having that opportunity to collaborate with peers. So when teachers have peers that they can go to, like you mentioned, Laura, you are really good at this, and I really need some help with this. Can we work together? That is the most effective kind of professional development you can have. And I've had the opportunity, or the pleasure of having the opportunity to be a reading coach for many years. So I have been in teachers' classrooms modeling lessons, co-teaching lessons, co-planning lessons, looking at evaluation and assessment data, and figuring out what to do with that. I've had that. That's been my experience for the last almost 15 years of my career, and it's been great. And what I've been able to see is growth from teachers that maybe wouldn't have been able to have that kind of growth if they were just going it alone. And I think that's supported through the data that Linda Darling-Hammond showed and shared with us this morning. It's that collaboration is probably one of the biggest pieces and most important pieces in this whole process.
And Title II under ESSA has substantially better possibility of those type of outcomes if it survives.
And in our survey of state teachers of the year, one of the things that they were very vocal about was the need for peer evaluation, and especially peers that knew their grade level, their content, and so on, because most principals, have one content maybe, and one experience or maybe a couple teaching at a grade level, and they don't have the information about what the teacher needs. And so having peer evaluation from someone who knows what they're doing is extremely valuable as sort of a practice or as a supplement to the real evaluation.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was about to go off card here and ask a question of my own, which has to do with almost that exact issue. In the data collection for the studies that I've done, and also just in informal conversation with administrators and teachers, what you see throughout is that so much of the burden of this falls on the principal. The principal is expected to be in every classroom so many times, to be the content expert, to be the pedagogy expert, to also manage the buses and the discipline and running the school, and then on top of that also be an instructional leader, and on top of that also manage the politics and the people, right, that go along with running a school. What are your thoughts on the principal's role in all this, and is it possible for a principal to do a very good job at all of this? And if so, how? I mean, how does one?
Just a personal experience I had with a principal who shall not be named, but he was great, and we were going in and watching teachers teach lessons, and because I had the content knowledge, I was sitting next to him, and I was sort of whispering in his ear the whole time, do you see when she's doing that? That's because he didn't know. That was not an area that he was. So I think principals need those kinds of supports, and I don't know how else you could do it, because you can't know it.
Into a system, how to make that systematic.
Yeah.
Well, I think it has to do with capacity as well. So a large district might have the financial wherewithal that they can possibly alleviate the load of a principal to let them be the true instructional coach, or you have a central office, et cetera, that supports some of those jobs. In a very small district, you have, if you're lucky, we see buildings that are now being shared by one principal over two buildings that are geographically split. So,
that's crazy.
And I want to do a 5 whys deep on that. Well, why is that? Because of funding. Well, why is funding? And we can go, it's a circular argument. So you either support them in the expectations you have, or you're going to have to change your expectations to what is available, which I hate that idea, but.
Thank you. This is a very broad question, but I like it. What is the best advice you can give to new teachers regarding teacher evaluation?
I was a trained reading recovery teacher, and One of the things that my teacher leader taught me was when a student is not successful, the first place you look is yourself. And not in a hypercritical way, but you look at, okay, what do I need to do or learn how to do? And it's just, you're always going to be in growth. And I think the willingness to have that ideal can make a huge difference in your career, because then you don't buy into, I'm an A, I'm a whatever the label is. It's about what you know that you do and what you value, to be self-extending.
I think I would tell them to be their own best advocate for their own growth, to be as pushy as they need it to be, to visit classrooms of their peers, to have as much very targeted professional development, and just be as big an advocate as possible for themselves.
And I would say get to know the evaluation instrument and process, because supposedly teachers are trained on that in most places, but not so much. If you look at Charlotte Danielson or Marzano or any of the others, and you look at the level descriptors, there are huge differences between one level and the next. So you look at that and you say, okay, here are the things that they're going to expect me to do if I want to get this score that I want. And I'm always amazed that teachers actually don't know. They think there's some sort of magic involved in getting these ratings sometimes, and it really is a matter of they need to, as one of you said, be your own best advocate by knowing what the evaluation system requires of you and making sure you're ready for that.
I also think, to just go along with that, going from a teacher point of view, is you have to be purposeful in what you do, and you have to know why you're doing what you do. And sometimes I see teachers who are very good at what they do, but they have a hard time articulating it. They don't know exactly why. They know it's right, but I can't really tell you why it's right. And I think you need to know why. I think you need to be able to articulate why, so that when you are defending, I'll use that term, defending your practice and trying to explain, you can articulate exactly why you're doing what you're doing, whether it's because it's part of the rubric or it's, you have to know why you're doing what you're doing. You have to be purposeful in your instruction at all times.
My advice for a new teacher would be the same advice I would give to an experienced teacher, is to find a mentor. Now, I know that sounds kind of odd because the school district provides you a mentor, but I'm looking at my career and it isn't always the person that is assigned to be your mentor. And I've had a lot of experiences, and there are only 2 people in my life that have been mentors. And both, if I would start talking about either one of them, I would just break into tears. But that influential in your life, and if you've had anyone to be a mentor to you, you know what I'm talking about. It's just invaluable. And so to seek out a mentor, hopefully it's the one that's been assigned to you. But even in addition to that, but to have conversations, to find peers who are willing to sit down with you and share things and want to see you grow, because they're out there. They're out there. And I just, the first time that I found a real mentor was like 30 years into my career. Really.
And that benefits both parties, because the mentor then gets to reflect and say, well, why do that? Well, this is why I do that. So it's a circular reinforcement for both people.
We're going to do one more question, and I'll see if anyone out here has some questions, and then we'll wrap it up. Thank you. This question I thought was interesting, and it has to do with student learning objectives, SLOs, and their incorporation. And I'll just read it as written. It says, all of the variations and individualized approaches suggested to teacher evaluation make sense to me as a practitioner and fit into the student learning objectives, SLOs in Ohio. However, this system presumes trust in the profession and in principals. Do you have thoughts on that?
Could you repeat that, please?
Question part.
All of the variations and individualized approaches suggested in teacher evaluation make sense to me as a practitioner, this is the person writing, and fit into the student learning objectives in Ohio. think that might be. Anyway, however, this system presumes trust in the profession and in principals. Do you have thoughts on that? Thoughts on the trust involved in the evaluation system, and then also bring in SLOs as part of a requiring trust, which that's definitely conversations I've had about SLOs involving requiring trust in order to be a valid.
Back when these first came out, I was doing a lot of work with different states, and the first idea of why aren't we using these, and one of the things that was clear is that trust issue, that, how do I know that this teacher who put together this plan has actually done these things, and, how do I know that there's the right evidence and it's the principal's thinking involved, because I'm not in the classroom or I don't know that content, and it's not comparable to that other teacher. So there were a lot of concerns about how to do it correctly. And one of the suggestions I made to in fact, a group of, I don't know if it's AFT or NEA at a state meeting, was one of the things you can do is have sort of a process to randomly look at the data, and say, okay, so in any given district, we're going to pull some of the data from student learning objectives, and we're going to see whether it matches up with the score that they got. And, sort of a double check system, which I think is sad that some people felt it was necessary, but at the same time, it was something that people were using against the idea of trying to have teachers in the position of collecting their own data.
So in some of our contracts, there are SLO committees or OTES committees bargained for that purpose. Specifically not for quote-unquote grading, but for approval. Have you addressed all the components for Ohio Student Learning Objective Procedure? And as much as possible for a collaborative group of administrators and teachers to say, I don't see enough supportive evidence here, or you haven't made the connection between your target goal and your rationale. There's two sides of looking at that. People who are driven by compliance will check mark, move on. People who want to engage in the conversation and the possible growth will do so. And sometimes there's a mix of both of those people in that committee or the group. So it always falls back to you have to put out a little bit of trust to begin with, and how it's repaid pretty much dictates the next direction you're going to go. So when people try to do the right thing but they're forced into compliance, it shuts them down. When people only do compliance and no one follows up on that, other people are like, well, why am I bothering? Got to start someplace.
All right. Thank you. At this point, I'd like to see if anyone out here has any questions for the panel. If you do, you can just stand up, or I can bring you this if you want. No, everybody's tired. Big lunch, tryptophan.
And it's a beautiful day out there.
It is a beautiful day. It was hot last week. Okay, so rather than talk about the weather, then I will wrap it up. I want to thank the panelists. Albie, thank you so much for volunteering to sit up here, and thank all of the attendees and the presenters. Appreciate it. Let's hand for the panel, please.
Nice paneling with you all.
Please remember to fill out your evaluation and leave it on the front table. If you would like, if you gave a presentation and you would like the card that was slid in announcing your presentation, feel free to take that. I'll be out there at the table to help you find that.
Take it to ESPN.
And we ask, if you don't mind, if you'll leave your name tag holder, that would be fantastic. If you want to keep the name tag, that's okay, but it helps us out. And thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.